There are places along the Danube where the river runs red. Not from war, though war has stained these banks often enough. Red from clay, churned up from vanished shores hundreds of miles upstream, swirling through the current like old blood refusing to settle. In winter, when snowmelt floods down from the Alps and the Carpathians, the water thickens into something that looks less like a river and more like a wound in the earth, carrying sediment that has lain undisturbed for millennia, now exposed, now visible, now lost again to the sea. The clay carries with it fragments, pottery shards, animal bone, charcoal from fires that burned 7,000 years ago. And these fragments sink back into the mud before anyone can see them, before anyone can ask what they mean. The Danube does not surrender its secrets willingly. Beneath the vineyards of Serbia, beneath the wheat fields of Romania and Bulgaria, beneath the black earth of Ukraine, lie the remains of something the history books barely mention. A culture older than the pyramids, older than Stonehenge, older than the written word as the world has agreed to recognize it. No pharaohs ruled here, no ziggurats rose, no epic poems survived to name these people, no clay tablets catalogued their kings, no conqueror's inscription carved their defeat into stone. They left no dynasty, no legend, no myth of their own making, and yet they built cities, not villages, not seasonal camps, cities, settlements that sprawled across hundreds of acres housing thousands, organised into grids, their streets aligned to the cardinal points, their buildings painted in spirals of red and black, their kilns firing pottery so refined that modern archaeologists struggle to replicate it with electric wheels and digital calipers. They smelted copper 1,000 years before the Bronze Age, buried their dead with gold that glitters in museum cases like captured firelight, and carved symbols into clay that some scholars call art, others call accounting, and a few, heretical, cautious, half-convinced, call writing. Writing that would predate Sumerian cuneiform by 2 millennia. Writing that remains, to this day, undeciphered. The story of old Europe, the term archaeologists use for this lost world, is not a story of gradual progress, of hunter-gatherers discovering farming, of farmers building villages, of villages growing into towns. It is a story of sudden emergence, of complexity appearing where it should not yet exist, of questions that refuse to resolve. How did cities arise here before the plough reached Mesopotamia? Who organised these communities, and why did they burn their own settlements every 80 years, deliberately, systematically, as if fire were not destruction but renewal? What knowledge did they possess, and why does it vanish so completely that by the time the Greeks plant colonies on the Black Sea coast, no memory remains? The river runs through all of it. The Danube, the Ister to the Greeks, the Danuvius to the Romans, is Europe's second longest river, and for 6,000 years it was the continent's first highway, carrying people, trade, ideas, and grain from the Black Forest to the Black Sea. It cuts through the iron gates, a narrow limestone gorge where the current runs so fast and cold that Roman engineers carved a road into the cliff face rather than risk the water, and it spreads into lazy bends across the Wallachian plain, where the silt builds islands that appear and vanish with the seasons. The people who lived along its banks knew its moods, its floods, its generosity and violence. They built on its terraces, fished its eddies, carved their gods from its stones. The river gave them life, and when their world collapsed, the river buried them. Standing on the banks today, in winter, when the flood runs high and red, one cannot help but feel the weight of that burial. The clay in the water is not simply sediment, it is the walls of houses, dissolved. It is the floors of temples, eroded. It is the graves of children, the kilns of potters, the thresholds where brides crossed into new homes, all reduced to particles too fine to see, suspended in a current that does not stop, that has never stopped, that will carry these fragments all the way to the delta and then into the sea, where they will settle in layers so deep that no excavation will ever reach them. What the river takes, the river keeps. But the river does not take everything. In the 1960s, before the water rose behind a new dam, archaeologists working against a ticking clock uncovered something that should not exist. A settlement on a cliff above the Danube, wedged into the narrow gorge where the river thunders between Serbia and Romania, where the current is so fierce that even modern cargo ships slow to a crawl. A place that had been occupied continuously or seasonally for 4,000 years. A place where people who had no agriculture, no pottery, no domesticated animals beyond the dog, built permanent structures from stone and river clay, arranged them in precise geometric patterns, aligned them to the river and the rising sun, and filled them with sculptures unlike anything found anywhere else in the prehistoric world. They called it Lepenski Vir, the Lepena whirlpool. The Iron Gates Gorge is not a place that invites settlement. The cliffs rise sheer from the water, limestone and schist folded into vertical bands, and the Danube, forced through a channel barely 100 meters wide, accelerates into rapids that the Romans considered impassable. The Roman Emperor Trajan, determined to subdue Dacia on the far bank, ordered a canal blasted through the rock and a military road carved into the cliff face, sections of it cantilevered on wooden beams driven into the stone. The road still clings there 2,000 years later, visible when the reservoir drops in summer, a scar that speaks to the difficulty of the crossing. And yet, 7,000 years before Trajan, people were already here, not passing through, living here, building here. Not in caves, though caves honeycomb the cliffs, but on narrow terraces just above the river, where the stone shelf is barely wide enough for a house, where a winter flood could sweep everything into the current, where the nearest arable land lies miles upstream or down. Why here? What drew them to this throat of stone and water, this place that offers no fields, no pasture, no easy path to anywhere? The river itself, perhaps. The Danube at the Iron Gates is one of the richest fisheries in Europe, fed by currents that churn nutrients from the riverbed and create eddies where catfish, carp, and sturgeon gather in numbers that defy belief. Medieval travellers reported fish so plentiful they could be scooped from the water with baskets. Ottoman tax records list entire villages whose tribute was paid in dried fish alone. For a Mesolithic hunter-gatherer, a society still dependent on wild game, wild plants, the seasonal migrations of animals, the gorge would have been paradise. Reliable, renewable, year-round protein, in quantities that could sustain not just families but communities, without the gamble of the hunt, without the unpredictability of the herd. And so they came. The earliest traces at Lepenski Vir date to around 9500 BC, in the warm centuries after the glaciers retreated, when the Danube was still cutting its modern channel through the uplifted plateau. Simple hearths, flint tools, fish bones piled in middens, the usual archaeological signature of mobile foragers. But by 7000 BC, something had changed. The settlement was no longer a camp, it was a village, and the village was not a collection of huts scattered across the terrace in whatever configuration convenience allowed. It was planned. The houses, if houses is even the right word, were trapezoidal, their floors paved with limestone slabs covered in lime mortar, tinted red or white, their walls framed with wooden posts and plastered with river clay. Each one faced the Danube, oriented with geometric precision so that the long axis pointed directly toward the opposite bank, toward a pyramidal peak called Treskovac that looms over the gorge like a sentinel. The buildings were arranged in a horseshoe, nested one inside another, the smallest at the centre, the largest at the open ends, all of them sized according to a strict ratio. The length of the side walls was exactly 3/4 the length of the front. Not approximately, not close enough. Exactly. 136 structures, organised into at least 5 phases of construction, rebuilt over centuries in the same pattern, the same proportions, the same alignment. This is not the architecture of expedience. This is the architecture of intention, of shared knowledge, of something that demands not simply shelter, but meaning. At the heart of each dwelling, between the central hearth and the river-facing wall, the builders placed a sculpture. They are difficult to look at even now, even under museum lights. Carved from river boulders, sandstone, quartzite, limestone smoothed by centuries of current, the figures are not quite human and not quite fish. The face, if it is a face, stares upward or outward. The eyes enormous, bulging, lidless, the mouth gaping in a grimace that might be speech or might be death. Some have torsos, shoulders, the suggestion of a neck. Others are only heads, emerging from the stone as if the carver had freed them from the boulder rather than imposed a shape upon it. The largest stand 1/2 meter tall, the the smallest fit in a cupped hand. Every one of them was placed in the floor, embedded in the lime mortar, immovable, so that to live in the house was to live with the figure, to step around it, to feed the fire beside it, to wake each morning and meet its unblinking gaze. Dragoslav Strajovic, the Serbian archaeologist who led the excavations between 1965 and 1970, called them ancestor figures. Others have called them river gods, fish spirits, shamanic totems, representations of the dead. The truth is, no one knows. The figures carry no inscriptions, no attributes that would tie them to a myth we recognize. They simply exist, carved with a skill that suggests long tradition, placed with a reverence that suggests profound belief, and then abandoned when the settlement was finally deserted around 5500 BC, left in their floors like guardians of an empty house. One sculpture, recovered from the central area of the site and now displayed in the National Museum in Belgrade, has come to be known as the progenitor. It is larger than most, more fully realized. A head, a neck, broad shoulders tapering into nothing, as if the lower body had dissolved or never existed. The face is wide, the cheekbones pronounced, the mouth open in a silent shout or song. The eyes are carved as deep hollows, shadow pooling in them even under direct light. Traces of pigment cling to the surface, red ochre in the recesses, and the stone itself, a fine-grained sandstone, has been polished smooth, the kind of finish that comes only from hours of rubbing with wet sand or leather. To call it beautiful would be wrong. To call it ugly would be wrong. It is arresting. It is other. It looks like nothing else created in the 7th millennium BC, not in Anatolia, not in the Levant, not in the early farming villages of the Fertile Crescent where pottery and weaving and the first mud brick temples were already taking shape. The art of Lepenski Vir is its own thing, isolated, without precedent, without successors, and yet the people who made it were not isolated. Bone chemistry and ancient DNA extracted from skeletons buried beneath the house floors tell a more complex story. The population of Lepenski Vir was mixed. Some individuals carried the genetic signature of indigenous Mesolithic hunter-gatherers, lineages that had lived in the Danube basin since the Ice Age, their ancestors tracking reindeer and mammoth across the tundra. Others carried Anatolian ancestry, the genetic marker of the first farmers, people whose great-great-grandparents had cultivated wheat and lentils on the plains of central Turkey, and then spread west, generation by generation, bringing domesticated plants and animals into a Europe that had never seen them. These two populations, forager and farmer, were living side by side at Lepenski Vir, marrying into each other's families, raising children together, burying their dead in the same floors. Isotope analysis of teeth and bone reveals the dietary evidence. Some individuals ate almost exclusively fish, the signature of a riverine hunter-gatherer lifeway. Others ate a mix of fish and terrestrial animals, including the meat and milk of domesticated sheep and cattle. One population teaching the other, or one population adopting the other's ways, or both, in a cultural negotiation so intimate that it left its mark in the bones of children. This is one of the earliest documented contact zones in European prehistory. Not conquest, not replacement. Contact, exchange. The kind of slow, cautious, generation-spanning process by which knowledge moves between peoples who do not speak the same language, who do not worship the same gods, who do not share the same stories about how the world began. And it was happening here, on a narrow terrace above a thundering river, in a place that should have been marginal, remote, irrelevant to the grand currents of Neolithic change. But Lepenski Vir was not marginal. It was a crossroads. The Danube connects the Alps to the Black Sea, and the Iron Gates Gorge is the only place where the river is forced into a single channel, where everyone travelling east or west must pass through the same few kilometres of stone and water. The people who lived here would have seen strangers regularly. Traders carrying obsidian from the Carpathians, hunters tracking aurochs downstream, perhaps even explorers from the new farming settlements pushing up the river valleys from the south. They would have heard languages they did not understand, seen tools and ornaments they had never imagined, tasted foods that did not grow in their world. And they would have made choices, to adopt the new or to hold to the old, to take the farmer's wheat or to refuse it, to carve the stone as their ancestors had carved it, or to let the tradition die. Lepenski Vir, for 1,000 years, chose both. The architecture remained consistent, the sculptures continued to be made, the reverence for the river endured. But the diet diversified, the genetics shifted, the boundaries blurred, until finally they did not. Around 5500 BC, the settlement was abandoned, not destroyed. There is no evidence of fire or violence, no scattered skeletons, no hasty burials. Simply abandoned. The houses left standing, the sculptures left in place, the hearths cold. The next time people built on this terrace, they were fully Neolithic, their pottery decorated with incised spirals and meanders, their houses rectangular, their dead buried in cemeteries rather than under floors. The old world of Lepenski Vir, the world of the fish-faced gods and the trapezoidal sanctuaries, was gone, but the question it poses is not gone. What happens when isolated communities, each with their own way of life, their own spiritual architecture, their own answers to the questions of survival and meaning, come into contact? What happens when the boundaries are not enforced by distance or hostility, but become permeable, negotiable, a matter of daily choice? Lepenski Vir is an answer to that question, but it is not the only answer. All along the Danube, from the Iron Gates downstream to the Black Sea, from the river's tributaries deep into the plains of Ukraine and Moldova, the same process was unfolding. Foragers were becoming farmers. Farmers were building villages. Villages were growing into something larger, and in a few places, in a few extraordinary moments, they were growing into cities. Not the cities we know from Mesopotamia or the Indus Valley, with their ziggurats and granaries and cuneiform archives. Not the cities of the pharaohs, with their tombs and temples and endless inscriptions proclaiming divine kingship. These were cities without kings, without palaces, without walls. Cities that appeared in the 5th millennium BC, flourished for 1,000 years, and then burned to ash, leaving behind only the faintest outline of what they had been. Cities that the textbooks, for a century, dismissed as villages, as anomalies, as exaggerations by nationalist archaeologists desperate to claim European priority in the invention of civilization. But the evidence does not lie, and the evidence, decade by decade, site by site, is becoming impossible to ignore. 60 kilometers downstream from Lepenski Vir, on the Serbian side of the Danube, a low hill rises above the floodplain, covered in vineyards that produce a sharp white wine the locals say tastes of river clay. In 1908, a Serbian archaeologist named Miloje Vasic began digging into that hill, hoping to find Roman remains. What he found instead was older, far older. Pottery painted with spirals and checkerboard patterns, clay figurines of women with exaggerated hips and breasts, houses with wooden frames and wattle and daub walls, and scattered among the domestic debris, hundreds of small clay objects marked with symbols. Lines, chevrons, crosses, grids, curves that might be letters or might be decoration, incised into pottery, scratched into ritual vessels, pressed into the clay before firing. Vasic called the site Vinča, after the modern village that occupied the hillside, and the symbols, he argued, were writing. Not pictures, not ornament, writing. A system of notation that allowed these people to record information, to communicate across time and space, to transmit knowledge in a form that could outlive memory. The proposal was met with polite skepticism. Writing, the scholarly consensus held, had been invented once in Sumer, around 3200 BC, in the service of temple bureaucracies that needed to track grain and livestock and tribute. It had then spread to Egypt, to the Indus, to China, each culture adapting the idea to its own needs. The notion that preliterate European farmers had independently developed a script 2,000 years earlier, and then somehow failed to use it for anything resembling administration, strained credulity. The symbols at Vinča, most archaeologists concluded, were potters' marks, clan signs, decorative motifs, meaningful perhaps, but not linguistic. And there the matter rested for decades, until other symbols began turning up. At Tartaria, in Romania, 3 clay tablets covered in signs were found in a ritual pit, alongside burnt human bones and sacrificial figurines. At Gradešnica, in Bulgaria, a pottery fragment bore an inscription that looked almost alphabetic, its characters arranged in rows. At Vinča itself, as excavations continued, the corpus grew to more than 700 distinct signs, some appearing only once, others repeated across multiple objects, some clustered together in combinations that suggested grammar, syntax, meaning. Was it writing? The debate rages still, conducted in the footnotes of archaeological journals, at conferences where scholars present statistical analyses of sign frequency and distribution, in books with titles that gesture toward caution. Proto-writing, symbolic systems, notational practices, without committing to the word that would change everything. Because if it is writing, if these symbols encode language, then the story of civilization does not begin in the river valleys of the Near East. It begins here, in the Balkans, among people who left no cities the Romans could recognize, no monuments the Greeks could admire, no conquest narrative that would justify their inclusion in the history taught to schoolchildren. It begins, perhaps, with a goddess and a bull, with spirals painted on pottery, with grain ground in stone querns, with copper axes smelted in crucibles and beaten into shape by hands that knew the properties of metal before the word Bronze Age was coined. It begins in the firelight, in the long houses where extended families slept together through the winter, where the hearth never went cold, where the walls were painted every year with fresh clay and the floors swept clean of ash and bone. It begins in the fields, in the first uncertain harvests, in the realization that if you saved the seed and planted it again, you did not have to follow the herds, did not have to move when the game moved, could stay in one place long enough to build something permanent, something that would outlast a single generation. It begins, in other words, with the choice to stop wandering. And that choice, made by communities all across the Danube basin in the centuries after 6000 BC, set in motion everything that followed. The river still runs, the clay still churns in the current, red and thick, carrying fragments that no one will ever name. The terraces at Lepenski Vir are quiet now, the sculptures removed to museums, the houses reconstructed as open-air exhibits for tourists who arrive by bus in the summer and take photographs against the backdrop of the gorge. The reservoir behind the Iron Gates dam laps at the base of the cliff, 20 metres higher than it was when Srejovich first laid his trowel into the soil, and the old shoreline, the pebble beaches where the Mesolithic fishermen dragged their boats, lies drowned beneath water that will never recede. But the question remains, who were these people before the river buried them? What did they know and what did they forget? What does it mean to build a city, to organise thousands of lives into a single coordinated effort, and then to burn it all and start again? What does it mean to carve symbols into clay, to repeat them across generations, to treat them as sacred or necessary or both, and then to let them fall silent, undeciphered, as if the knowledge they encoded was no longer needed or no longer understood? The answers lie downstream, in the cities that rose, in the gold that gleamed, in the fire that swept across the steppe, erasing a world that had believed itself eternal. The birth of Old Europe. There are moments in the study of deep time when the sheer weight of evidence forces a reckoning, when the accumulated data from 1,000 excavations, 100 radiocarbon dates, 10,000 potsherds and figurines and house foundations demand that the map be redrawn, that the story be told differently. The Balkans in the late 20th century became such a moment. Across the river valleys and Piedmont plains of what is now Serbia, Romania, Bulgaria and Hungary, archaeologists working in relative obscurity, Eastern European scholars often isolated from the Western academic mainstream by politics, language and funding, had been uncovering a landscape dense with tells, with multi-layered settlement mounds that spoke to centuries of continuous habitation, with pottery assemblages of startling sophistication, with figurines that suggested cosmologies as complex as anything emerging in Anatolia or the Levant. Yet the narrative of civilization's birth remained stubbornly fixed on the Fertile Crescent, on Mesopotamia and Egypt, on the river valleys where writing and cities and kingship first appeared, in the forms that later empires would recognize and claim as their own. The Balkans, in this telling, were a backwater, a frontier, a place where ideas diffused slowly from the civilized south, where farming arrived late and literacy never took hold, where the indigenous populations remained locked in a prolonged Neolithic twilight, until the arrival of more dynamic peoples from elsewhere brought them finally into history. It was Maria Gimbutas who named the alternative. Born in Vilnius in 1921, trained in archaeology and linguistics in wartime Lithuania and post-war Germany, emigrating to the United States in 1949, Gimbutas became Professor of European Archaeology at UCLA and spent 3 decades synthesizing the fragmentary evidence from hundreds of sites into a coherent vision of what she called Old Europe. The term first appeared in her 1973 article, Old Europe Celis 7000, 3500 BC, the earliest European civilization before the infiltration of the Indo-European peoples, published in the Journal of Indo-European Studies, and it was deliberately provocative. Old Europe, in Gimbutas's formulation, was not a single culture, but a cultural complex, a network of related societies spanning roughly 7000 to 3500 BC across the Balkans, the Carpathian Basin, and the lower Danube, characterized by settled agricultural villages, elaborate symbolic systems expressed through pottery and figurines, early metallurgy, long-distance trade, and, most controversially, an apparent absence of fortifications, weapons, and evidence of organized warfare. It was, she argued, a civilization in its own right, predating and in some respects exceeding the achievements of early Mesopotamia, and it was matrilineal, possibly matriarchal, centered on the worship of a great goddess, whose image appeared in 1,000 variations across the tells and cemeteries of Southeast Europe. The reaction was swift and divided. Feminist scholars embraced the vision of a peaceful, goddess-worshipping prehistory as a counter-narrative to the patriarchal violence they saw encoded in later Bronze Age and classical societies. Mainstream archaeologists, particularly in Britain and the United States, dismissed it as speculative, as an overreach built on selective interpretation of ambiguous evidence, as a conflation of myth and archaeology that violated the disciplinary boundaries both fields had worked to establish. Gimbutas herself was unapologetic. A combination of fields, archaeology, mythology, linguistics, and historical data, provides the possibility for apprehending both the material and spiritual realities of prehistoric cultures, she wrote, coining the term archaeomythology to describe her method. Whether one accepts the full scope of her interpretation or not, the chronological and geographic frame she established has endured. Old Europe is no longer a fringe hypothesis. It is the name given to the Neolithic and Chalcolithic societies that flourished across Southeast Europe for more than 3 millennia, societies whose complexity, longevity, and cultural richness are now acknowledged even by scholars who reject Gimbutas's more sweeping claims about gender and religion. The map has been redrawn. The story begins here. The earliest horizon of this world emerges along the middle Danube and its tributaries in the centuries around 6000 BC. The Starčevo culture, named after a type site near the confluence of the Danube and the Tisa in what is now northern Serbia, represents one of the first fully Neolithic populations in the central Balkans. These were farming communities, their subsistence built on the cultivation of wheat, barley and lentils, on the herding of cattle, sheep and goats, on the slow, patient work of clearing forest, breaking soil, planting, harvesting, storing. Their houses were modest, often semi-subterranean pit dwellings, with wattle and daub walls and thatched roofs, clustered into villages that might hold a few dozen families. The pottery was simple but well made, incised with geometric patterns, fired in open pits. The dead were buried in cemeteries outside the settlement, often in a flexed position, accompanied by a few personal items, beads, stone tools, the occasional ceramic vessel. There is no evidence of central authority, no palaces or temples, no prestige goods that would signal a hereditary elite. What there is instead is continuity. Starčevo sites show occupation spanning centuries, layers of house floors and hearths, and refuse pits accumulating into tells, into artificial mounds that mark the landscape like cairns, like monuments to the sheer persistence of a way of life. By 5400 BC, a new pattern begins to crystallize. The Vinča culture, named for the tell on the Danube downstream from modern Belgrade, emerges as the dominant cultural horizon across Serbia, western Romania, and parts of Hungary. It is not a conquest, not a replacement of one population by another, but an intensification, a deepening of trends already visible in the Starčevo period. Vinča settlements are larger, more densely packed, more clearly organized along principles that suggest planning, coordination, communal decision-making at a scale that dwarfs anything seen in the preceding millennia. The pottery becomes darker, burnished to a high sheen, decorated with incise spirals and meanders, and abstract motifs that repeat across hundreds of kilometers, across generations, as if the same symbolic grammar were being spoken from the Morava Valley to the Transylvanian plateau. Figurines proliferate, anthropomorphic and zoomorphic, stylized to the point of abstraction, their features reduced to essential forms: breasts, hips, beaked faces, upraised arms. Some are clearly female, some ambiguously gendered, some seem to represent animals or hybrid beings that blend human and animal attributes. Were they deities, ancestors, clan totems, representations of mythological narratives now lost? The archaeologists who unearth them measure, photograph, catalogue, publish, and admit they do not know. The figurines remain silent, the symbols incised on their surfaces remain unread. And it is here, in the long twilight between Lepenski Vir's abandonment and the rise of the great tells that would define the Chalcolithic, that the question of continuity becomes acute. Did the descendants of the Mesolithic fishermen become the Neolithic farmers, or were they displaced, absorbed, erased by incoming populations carrying new technologies and new gods? The genetic evidence is still being assembled, the ancient DNA extracted from bones buried millennia ago now sequenced and compared in labs that can trace lineages across continents and millennia. What is clear is that by 5000 BC, the Danube basin is no longer a frontier, it is a heartland. The tells that rise along the river and its tributaries, Vinča, Podporanj, Selevac, Plochnik, Belovode, are not villages in the sense that word implies to modern ears, not loose aggregations of farmsteads, but organised settlements with populations in the thousands, with craft specialisation and long-distance trade networks, and evidence of copper smelting that predates the conventional beginning of the Bronze Age by a millennium. They are, in every sense that matters, cities, and they are writing. Or at least someone is making marks that look very much like writing, marks that spread across a landscape as broad as Sumer's, marks that persist for 1,000 years and then vanish, leaving behind a mystery that still resists every attempt to crack it. Vinča, the city beneath the vineyard. The mound rises from the flat alluvial plain on the right bank of the Danube. 10 hectares of gently sloping earth covered in grass and wildflowers, in the tangled roots of old vines that gave the site its name. Vinča Belo Brdo, the White Hill, sits just 14 kilometers downstream from Belgrade, close enough that the city's suburbs now press against its northern edge, close enough that the sound of traffic from the highway carries across the fields on still mornings. It does not look like much. There is no grand architecture, no standing walls or monumental gates, none of the visual drama that draws tourists to Mycenae or Knossos or the ziggurats of Mesopotamia. What Vinča offers is depth, 9 meters of it, layer upon layer of compacted earth and ash and pottery sherds and animal bones, and the remains of houses built, inhabited, collapsed, and built again on the same spot over the course of more than 1,000 years. The mound is a palimpsest, a manuscript written and erased and written over so many times that teasing apart the individual layers, the distinct phases of occupation, requires the patience of a surgeon and the mind of a historian who can think in centuries. Excavations began in 1908, led by Miloje Vasic, the first professionally trained Serbian archaeologist. Vasic had studied in Berlin and returned to Belgrade with ambitions to establish his country's archaeological credentials, to prove that the lands along the Danube had a prehistory as rich and complex as anything being unearthed in Greece or Anatolia. He chose Vinča because local farmers had been finding pottery and figurines in the soil for generations, because the mound was conspicuous and clearly artificial, because it was close to the capital and accessible by rail. The first trenches went down in the summer of 1908, and what they revealed astonished even Vasic. The mound was not the remains of a single settlement, but a vertical city, phase stacked upon phase, each layer separated by a sterile lens of flood silt or fire ash, each layer dense with the detritus of daily life: hearths, storage pits, loom weights, grinding stones, bone tools, obsidian blades imported from Hungary or Anatolia, shells from the Aegean, figurines by the hundreds, pottery in styles that shifted subtly with each generation. Vasic worked the site for more than 2 decades, through the Balkan Wars and the First World War and the lean years that followed, publishing his findings in a monumental 4-volume study, Prehistoric Vinča, that remains a foundational text in Balkan archaeology, despite the limitations of early 20th century methods. Later excavations, beginning in the 1970s and continuing into the present century, have refined the chronology and expanded the picture. Vinča was occupied from the early Neolithic, around 5700 BC, through the Chalcolithic and into the early Bronze Age, with the densest and most culturally distinctive phases falling between 5300 and 4500 BC. At its peak, the settlement covered the full 10 hectares of the mound and extended beyond it into areas now lost to erosion and modern development. Population estimates vary, but the density of house foundations and the sheer volume of refuse suggest a community of several thousand people, possibly as many as 2,500 at the height of the Vinča culture. The houses were substantial structures, 2 stories in many cases, built with timber frames and walls of wattle plastered with clay, then fired in place to a hardness approaching terracotta. The ground floors served as workshops and storage areas. The upper floors, reached by ladders, were living quarters. Each house had a central hearth, a clay oven for baking bread, storage bins set into the floor for grain and pulses. The houses were arranged along lanes, clustered into neighbourhoods that suggest extended family groups or clans, and the lanes themselves were maintained, swept clean of refuse, repaired when heavy rains cut gullies into the packed earth. What strikes every visitor to the reconstructed houses, every scholar who has studied the site plans, is the degree of organisation. This was not a haphazard sprawl of homesteads, not a village that grew organically as families built wherever land was available. Vinča was planned. The orientation of the houses, the spacing of the lanes, the placement of communal structures, ovens, storage facilities, what may have been shrines or meeting halls, all suggest coordination at a scale that requires collective decision-making, requires some mechanism for mediating disputes and allocating resources and ensuring that the community as a whole functions smoothly. Yet there is no palace, no fortified citadel, no central storehouse that would indicate the presence of a ruling class or a redistributive economy controlled by elites. The houses vary in size and construction quality, but not dramatically. The graves vary in grave goods, but not in a way that suggests a hereditary aristocracy. Vinča, like the other great tales of the Balkans, seems to have been organised along principles that are almost invisible to us, that do not map onto the models of chiefdoms and states and tributary empires that dominate the archaeology of later periods. And this presents a problem. For more than a century, the narrative of urban origins has been clear. Cities emerge in Mesopotamia, specifically in the alluvial plains of southern Iraq, beginning with the late Uruk period around 3800 to 3100 BC. Uruk itself, at its peak, covered some 6 square kilometres and housed upwards of 50,000 people, making it the largest settlement in the world at the time and the first true city in the modern sense. A dense, nucleated population engaged in a wide range of specialised economic activities, supported by agricultural surpluses extracted from a rural hinterland, governed by a literate elite operating out of temple complexes that doubled as administrative and economic centres. This is the model. This is where civilization begins in the conventional telling, and everything that precedes it is background, is the long, slow climb from village to town to city, from kinship to kingship, from myth to history. Yet Vinča predates Uruk by more than a millennium, and while it lacks the monumental architecture, the sprawling administrative apparatus, the unambiguous evidence of writing that defines Uruk, it possesses urban characteristics that cannot be dismissed. The population density, the economic specialization, potters, weavers, metallurgists, each practicing a craft that requires years of training and produces goods that circulate far beyond the settlement itself. The long-distance trade networks, evidenced by obsidian from the Carpathians, shells from the Mediterranean, copper from mines in Serbia and Bulgaria. The sheer longevity, the fact that people chose to live in this one place, to build and rebuild on the same 10 hectares for more than 1,000 years, suggests a level of social cohesion, of collective identity, that is not typical of dispersed farming communities. Vinča was not Uruk, but it was not a village either. It was something in between, something the existing vocabulary struggles to capture. A proto-city, perhaps, an urban community without the state apparatus that we have come to associate with urbanism, a place where thousands of people lived together, worked together, negotiated the frictions and intimacies of close-packed life together, and did so without kings. The question, then, is how? How does a community of that size and complexity organize itself without hierarchy, without coercion, without the threat of violence to enforce order? The archaeologists who study Vinča speak cautiously of heterarchy rather than hierarchy, of decision-making distributed across lineages or sodalities or councils of elders rather than concentrated in the hands of a single ruler or ruling class. They point to the relative uniformity of house size and construction quality, to the absence of fortifications or weapons in the early phases, to the fact that storage facilities appear to be communally managed rather than controlled by individual households. They point to the figurines, the elaborate symbolic systems, and suggest that ritual, religion, shared cosmology may have provided the social glue that held these communities together, that gave individuals a sense of belonging to something larger than their own household or clan. But these are hypotheses, inferences drawn from material remains that are always fragmentary, always open to multiple interpretations. The truth is that we do not know, we cannot ask them. We can only sift through the ash and clay and bone, layer by patient layer, and try to imagine what it was like to live in a city where the centre was everywhere and the periphery nowhere, where power, if it existed at all, was diffuse, invisible, woven into the fabric of everyday life in ways that left no trace for us to find. The symbols that should not exist. And then there are the signs, incised into pottery, scratched onto the surfaces of figurines, carved into spindle whorls and loom weights, and ritual objects whose function remains obscure. The symbols appear at Vinča and at dozens of other sites across the Balkans, from the Morava Valley to the plains of Wallachia, from the Iron Gates to the foothills of the Carpathians. More than 700 distinct signs have been catalogued, some appearing only once in the entire corpus, others repeated across multiple objects and multiple sites, some simple geometric forms, lines, crosses, chevrons, others more complex, resembling stylized representations of animals, plants, or human figures. Some are isolated, single marks placed on the base of a pot or the back of a figurine. Others are clustered into groups arranged in rows or columns, combined in ways that suggest syntax, that suggest the marks are related to one another, that they encode something more than mere decoration. The debate over their meaning, over whether they constitute writing in any meaningful sense, has raged for more than half a century. The Tartaria tablets, discovered in 1961 in a ritual pit in Romania, alongside burnt human bones and broken figurines, became a flashpoint almost immediately. 3 small clay plaques, each bearing a series of incised signs, dated by association to around 5300 BC, more than 2,000 years before the earliest proto-cuneiform tablets from Uruk. If the dating was correct, if the signs were writing, then the entire narrative of literacy's origins would have to be rewritten. The Mesopotamian primacy would fall. The cradle of civilization would shift west into the Balkans, into a region that most historians had dismissed as peripheral, as a recipient rather than a generator of cultural innovation. The skeptics responded swiftly. The radiocarbon dates, they argued, were unreliable, based on burnt bone and organic inclusions in the clay that could have been contaminated by older carbon. The signs themselves were too few, too varied, too lacking in the repetitive sequences that characterize true writing systems. Writing, in the strict sense, requires a correspondence between signs and linguistic units, words, syllables, phonemes, and the capacity to encode any utterance in a given language through a finite set of symbols. The Vinča signs, the skeptics insisted, did not meet this threshold. They were ownership marks, clan totems, ritual symbols, potters' signatures, calendar notations, tally marks for counting livestock or measures of grain. They were many things, perhaps, but they were not writing. Yet the signs do not behave like random marks. Studies of sign distribution, of which signs appear together and which do not, reveal patterns that are difficult to explain as mere decoration. Harald Hamann, a German linguist and specialist in ancient scripts, has argued that the Vinča symbols represent a form of proto-writing, a transitional stage between pure iconography and full phonetic writing, comparable to the earlier stages of Sumerian or Chinese script. He points to the consistency of certain sign combinations across sites separated by hundreds of kilometers, to the fact that some signs appear only on specific types of objects, spindle whorls but not pottery, figurines but not tools, which suggest they carried specific meanings, specific associations that were understood across the cultural network of Old Europe. He points too to the sheer antiquity, to the fact that the tradition of marking objects with incised symbols extends back to at least 5500 BC and continues, in various forms, until around 3500 BC, a span of 2000 years during which the system, whatever it was, remained stable enough to be recognized and reproduced by successive generations. Maria Gimbutas went further. She described the signs as an alphabet of the metaphysical, a symbolic language that encoded the cosmological beliefs of Neolithic Europe, a script of the sacred rather than the profane. For Gimbutas, the symbols were not primarily utilitarian, not records of transactions or inventories, but expressions of a worldview in which the natural and supernatural were interwoven, in which every object, every act of making, was imbued with ritual significance. The figurines, she argued, were not dolls or toys, but representations of deities or mythological beings, and the signs inscribed upon them were prayers, invocations, names of power. The pottery, decorated with spirals and meanders and zigzag lines, was not merely functional but cosmological, each pattern a map of the universe as understood by the people who made it. Mainstream archaeology has never fully accepted Gimbutas's interpretation, and the question of the Vinča symbols remains unresolved. What is beyond dispute is the fact of their existence, their distribution, their persistence. Someone, across a vast stretch of time and geography, was making these marks. Someone believed they mattered. Someone taught the next generation how to make them, where to place them, what forms were permissible and what were not. And then, sometime around 3500 BC, the tradition ended. The signs disappear from the archaeological record, or rather they become so rare, so sporadic, that they can no longer be said to constitute a system. The tells are abandoned or destroyed. The long stable horizon of the Vinča culture and its successors gives way to upheaval, to demographic collapse, to the arrival of new populations from the steppe, whose burial customs and material culture mark them as fundamentally different from the farmers who had inhabited the Balkans for 3 millennia. What happened? Why did the symbols fall silent? Were they tied to a social or religious system that collapsed and could not be rebuilt? Were they the preserve of a specialist class, priestesses perhaps, or scribes, or ritual practitioners, whose knowledge was lost when the communities they served disintegrated? Or were they always marginal, always peripheral to the lived experience of the majority, and their disappearance is less a sign of collapse than of a shift in priorities, a decision by later generations that the old marks no longer served their needs? We do not know. We have the marks, hundreds of them, scattered across museum collections, catalogued in typologies that group them by shape and context and frequency. We have statistical analyses, computer models that test whether the distribution patterns are consistent with linguistic structure or random variation. We have theories, compelling and contradicted, published in academic journals and debated at conferences where specialists gather to present their latest findings and argue, politely but fiercely, over what these ancient marks mean. But we do not have the key. We do not have a bilingual inscription, a Rosetta Stone that would allow us to match the Vinča signs to a known language. We do not even have certainty that a known language exists to match them to, that the people who made these marks spoke a tongue whose descendants survive in any form that modern linguistics can recognize. What we have is the fact of their making. The fact that someone, 6,000 years ago, looked at a piece of wet clay and decided it was not complete until a symbol had been pressed into its surface. The fact that this act, repeated across generations, across the breadth of the Balkans, created a corpus large enough, consistent enough, deliberate enough that we cannot dismiss it as mere ornament. The fact that these marks preceded by 2 millennia the earliest writing in Mesopotamia, the earliest scripts in Egypt, the earliest characters in China, and that we still do not know what they say, that we may never know, that the silence in the end is as profound as the symbols themselves, a silence that speaks to the fragility of knowledge, to the ease with which entire systems of meaning can vanish, can leave behind only the traces of their passing, marks on clay that no living voice will ever sound again. The work continues. On a low terrace above the Toplica River in southern Serbia, beneath tarps stretched taut against the summer sun, a team of archaeologists moves through the slow, methodical choreography of excavation. The site is Plochnik, a sprawling tell that once held thousands, and the lead archaeologist is Julka Kuzmanović-Cvetković, a specialist in Vinča metallurgy and ceramic analysis based at the Museum of Toplica in Prokuplje. She kneels at the edge of a freshly opened trench, a trowel in one hand, a brush in the other, and around her the grid extends in a precise geometry of string lines and numbered stakes. Each square metre has been mapped, photographed, recorded. Each bucket of soil will be sieved, the dark earth shaken through mesh screens to catch the fragments that might otherwise be lost. Seeds, charcoal, flakes of bone, sherds no larger than a fingernail. This is the texture of archaeological labour, the patient accumulation of data, the refusal to hurry. A student crouches beside a storage jar embedded in the floor of a collapsed house, its rim broken but its body intact, and uses a soft brush to clear the soil from the incised lines that spiral down its shoulder. The lines are deliberate, each one cut into the wet clay before firing, and they form a pattern that repeats, with variations, on dozens of other vessels recovered from this site and others like it across the Vinča heartland. Kuzmanović-Cvetković straightens, wipes her hands on her trousers, and walks over to inspect the jar. She has seen hundreds of these symbols over the course of her career, catalogued them, photographed them, compared them to examples from other sites, and she can read the shape of the debate in every one. Are they writing? Are they decoration? Are they marks of ownership, clan affiliation, ritual significance? Or are they something else entirely, something for which our modern categories are inadequate? The central frustration, she will tell you, is the absence of a key. When Jean-François Champollion deciphered Egyptian hieroglyphs in the 1820s, he had the Rosetta Stone, a single inscribed slab that presented the same text in three scripts: Greek, Demotic, and hieroglyphic. The Greek was known, the others could be matched to it, sound by sound, word by word, until the language emerged. The Vinča symbols have no such bridge. There is no bilingual inscription, no parallel text in a known language that might unlock the signs. There is only the corpus itself scattered across the Balkans, and the statistical methods archaeologists and linguists bring to bear upon it. Frequency counts, distributional analyses, tests for redundancy and recursion that might reveal whether the signs are functioning as a script or merely as a repertoire of motifs. The results so far are ambiguous. Some researchers, comparing the Vinča signs to early Sumerian cuneiform and Proto-Elamite scripts, have argued that the distribution patterns are consistent with a writing system, or at least a proto-writing system, a symbolic code sophisticated enough to record information but not yet fully phonetic. Others counter that the sample size is too small, the context too uncertain, the signs too variable to support such a claim. Without external corroboration, without a tradition of literacy that extends beyond these few centuries, the safest interpretation is that the marks are symbolic, religious or mnemonic, meaningful to the people who made them but not linguistic in the sense that cuneiform or alphabetic scripts are linguistic. Kuzmanović-Cvetković does not claim to have solved the mystery. What she and her colleagues are doing, season after season, is building the archive, recovering the objects, documenting their contexts, assembling the raw material that future researchers, with future methods, might be able to interpret more fully. Each sherd is numbered, bagged, logged into a database that tracks its find spot down to the centimetre. Each season's excavation is mapped in 3 dimensions, the layers digitised so that the stratigraphy can be rotated, sectioned, analysed long after the trenches have been backfilled. The field is not glamorous. It is hot in summer, cold in autumn, and the work is repetitive, demanding, often frustrating. But it is necessary, because without the patient accumulation of evidence, without the meticulous recording of context, there is no basis for interpretation. The symbols remain mute. The past stays locked. Standing in the trench, one cannot help but feel the weight of that silence. The jar at her feet is nearly 6,000 years old. The hands that shaped it, that incised the lines into its surface, have been dust for millennia. The voice that might have spoken the meaning of those lines, if meaning they had, is gone. The language, if language it was, survives in no descendant tongue that we can trace. What remains is the mark itself, a trace of intentionality, of a decision made by a mind long vanished that this sign should be here, on this vessel, in this place. And the mark, mute and patient, waits. It has waited through the collapse of the culture that made it, through the arrival of new peoples and the abandonment of the tells, through centuries of ploughing and erosion and the slow burial of the past beneath the accumulated sediment of later ages. It has waited through the rediscovery of the site, the arrival of archaeologists with their tools and their questions, their grids and their typologies. It waits still. Whether it will ever speak again is uncertain. What is certain is that someone believed it was worth making, that someone taught another how to make it, that the tradition persisted across generations, across the breadth of a culture, until the moment when it did not. The silence that followed is part of the mystery. The archive that archaeologists are building fragment by fragment is an attempt to preserve what can be preserved, to hold open the possibility that one day, with new methods or new discoveries, the silence might be broken. Until then, the work continues. The soil is sieved, the sherds are catalogued, the symbols are photographed, measured, compared, and the questions remain. Elsewhere in the Vinča world, the questions take a different form. In the dark earth of abandoned houses, in the refuse pits and hearths and storage chambers of the tells, archaeologists recover thousands of small clay figures. They are anthropomorphic, zoomorphic, sometimes ambiguous. The human figures are stylized, often female in form, with exaggerated hips and thighs, small conical or cylindrical heads, and minimal facial features, sometimes just incised lines for eyes, sometimes a simple ridge for a nose, sometimes nothing at all. The surfaces are burnished, dark and lustrous, or painted with red ochre. Some wear engraved belts or skirts suggesting clothing. Some have perforated heads, as though meant to be hung or worn. Some are seated, others standing, and a few are depicted in postures that seem to suggest childbirth or ritual gesture. The zoomorphic figures are less common but equally stylized. Cattle, pigs, birds, creatures whose exact species cannot always be determined but whose presence suggests the importance of animals in the symbolic life of the community. The sheer number of these objects is striking. Thousands have been recovered from Vinča sites alone, and thousands more from related cultures across the Balkans. They are found in domestic contexts, in households where people cooked and ate and slept, and they are found in what appear to be ritual or communal spaces, sometimes clustered together, sometimes carefully placed in pits or beneath floors. What did they mean? What function did they serve? Maria Gimbutas had an answer. To her, the figurines were evidence of a goddess-centered religion, a cosmology in which the divine was conceived as female, generative, tied to the cycles of fertility and renewal that governed agricultural life. The exaggerated bodies, the emphasis on hips and breasts, the association with hearths and storage, these, she argued, were signs of a civilization that venerated the goddess, a singular or multiform deity who presided over birth, death, and regeneration. The figurines were votives, perhaps, or representations of the deity herself, or of priestesses who served in her cult. The lack of weapons, the absence of fortifications, the apparent egalitarianism of the settlements, all of this in Gimbutas's reading, pointed to a peaceful matriarchal society, one in which women held positions of spiritual and possibly political authority, and in which warfare and domination were not yet the organizing principles of social life. Her work, published in the 1970s and 1980s, resonated powerfully with feminist scholars and with popular audiences seeking alternatives to the male-dominated narratives of Bronze Age kingship and conquest. It offered a vision of prehistory in which hierarchy and violence were not inevitable, in which other forms of social organization had existed and flourished for thousands of years before being swept aside by the arrival of Indo-European pastoralists from the steppe. But the interpretation has not gone unchallenged. Critics, notably archaeologist Lynn Meskel, have argued that the evidence for organized goddess worship is overstated, that Gimbutas's reading projects modern ideological concerns onto the ancient past. The figurines, Meskel suggests, are diverse in form and context, and there is no single explanation that accounts for all of them. Some may be votive objects, offerings made to household deities or ancestors. Some may be apotropaic, protective charms meant to ward off harm or ensure fertility. Some may be children's toys or teaching tools, or representations of real individuals, ancestors perhaps, whose memory was honoured in clay. The emphasis on female forms does not necessarily imply a female deity, much less a matriarchal society. In many cultures, past and present, figurines depicting women are used in rituals surrounding childbirth, marriage, and mourning, and their presence does not correlate with female political or economic dominance. The lack of weapons and fortifications, far from proving a peaceful society, may simply reflect the fact that the Vinča culture existed in a period and place where large-scale organised violence had not yet become common, a situation that would change dramatically in the 4th millennium BC with the arrival of new populations and new technologies. The figurines, in Mescal's view, are better understood as part of a complex symbolic system whose meanings varied across time and space, a system that cannot be reduced to a single overarching narrative of goddess worship or matriarchy. The debate is not merely academic. The figurines are the most visible, most evocative artifacts of the Vinča culture, and the interpretation placed upon them shapes our understanding of the entire society. Were these communities egalitarian or hierarchical, matriarchal or mixed, peaceful or merely undefended? Did they venerate a goddess, many goddesses, gods, ancestors, or something else entirely? The answers matter because they determine how we tell the story of old Europe, whether we present it as an alternative model of civilization or as one more variant in the long history of hierarchical stratified societies. The figurines themselves do not resolve the question. A clay form, however evocative, does not speak. It does not announce its purpose. It can be read in multiple ways, and each reading carries with it a set of assumptions about gender, power, religion, and social structure. What is beyond dispute is that the people of the Vinča culture made these objects in great numbers, that they placed them in contexts that suggest deliberate, meaningful action, and that the tradition persisted for centuries. Someone valued them, someone believed they served a purpose, and then, like the symbols on the pottery, the tradition faded. The figurines become rarer in the later phases of the Vinča culture, and by the time the tells are abandoned, the practice of making them has largely ceased. What replaced them, if anything, is unclear. The silence once again is profound. To the east, across the forested spine of the Carpathians, the landscape opens into the rolling plains of Moldova and western Ukraine, the broad watersheds of the Prut and the Dniester, the grasslands that stretch toward the distant Dnieper. Here, in a region that marks the eastern edge of the old European world, another culture was taking shape, one that would become the longest-lived and, in some respects, the most astonishing of all the Neolithic societies of Europe. The Cucuteni-Trypillia culture, named for two villages where its distinctive pottery was first identified in the late 19th century, emerged around 5400 BC and endured in various phases until approximately 2700 BC. It was contemporary with the Vinča culture in its early stages, and it outlasted Vinča by more than a millennium, persisting into an era when the Bronze Age was already well established in Mesopotamia and the eastern Mediterranean. Its geographic range was vast, encompassing an area of some 350,000 square kilometres, from the Carpathian foothills in the west to the Dnieper River in the east, a territory larger than modern Italy. At its peak, the culture may have supported a population of over 1 million people, making it one of the largest Neolithic societies in the world. The discovery of the culture was a product of the same late 19th century archaeological enthusiasm that brought the Vinča culture to light. In Romania, excavations at the village of Cucuteni in the 1880s revealed layers of burned houses and extraordinary painted pottery. In Ukraine, Vicente Kavoyka, a Czech-born archaeologist working near the town of Trypillia, encountered similar material in the 1890s and presented his findings at the Congress of Archaeologists in 1897. The two regions, it became clear, were part of a single cultural phenomenon, and the twin names, Cucuteni in the west, Trypillia in the east, reflect the dual origin of the research tradition. The culture's pottery is among the most visually striking in all of prehistoric Europe. The vessels are painted in intricate polychrome designs, spirals, meanders, zigzags, bands of geometric ornament, rendered in black, red and white pigments derived from minerals and fired in advanced two-chambered kilns at temperatures approaching 1800 degrees Fahrenheit. The patterns seem to move when the vessels are turned, the spirals unwinding and rewinding in an optical effect that suggests the potters understood not just the technical demands of ceramic production, but the psychology of visual perception. The designs are not random. They follow rules, conventions, schemas that vary by region and period, but that always display a concern for balance, symmetry, rhythm. To hold one of these vessels is to hold an object that was made not merely to contain grain or water, but to embody a vision, a cosmology, a sense of order imposed upon the chaos of the natural world. The geographic scope of the culture is remarkable. Sites have been identified from the eastern slopes of the Carpathians to the open steppe beyond the Dnieper, a distance of hundreds of kilometers, and the distribution of pottery styles suggests sustained contact and exchange across this entire region. The culture was not isolated. Trade networks carried obsidian from Carpathian sources, salt from the uplands, copper from emerging mining centres, and the painted pottery itself, which has been found far beyond the core territory, suggesting that it was valued not just locally but across a wider sphere of interaction. The temporal depth is equally striking. From the earliest phases in the mid-6th millennium BC to the final abandonment of the megasites in the late 4th millennium, the Cucuteni-Trypillia culture persisted for more than 2,500 years, longer than the span from the fall of Rome to the present day. It witnessed the rise and fall of entire dynasties in Mesopotamia, the construction of the pyramids in Egypt, the spread of farming across the whole of Europe. And yet until recently, it remained largely unknown outside the specialist literature, overshadowed by the more famous civilizations of the Near East and the Mediterranean. Why? Perhaps because it left no texts, no monumental architecture in stone, no kings whose names could be inscribed and remembered. Perhaps because its greatest achievements, its pottery, its social organization, its astonishing mega-settlements, did not fit the conventional narratives of how civilization emerges, of how cities are built. Perhaps because the culture collapsed, abruptly and completely, in the centuries around 3500 BC, and what followed bore little resemblance to what had come before. But before the collapse there was the flowering. And the flowering, in the middle phases of the Cucuteni-Trypillia culture, took a form that defies easy explanation and that continues to provoke wonder and debate among archaeologists working in the region today. We will turn to that form, to the scale and geometry of the mega-settlements, in due course. For now, what matters is the recognition that here, on the edge of the steppe, a Neolithic society sustained itself for longer than any of its Western neighbours, that it produced art of extraordinary sophistication, that it participated in networks of exchange that stretched across the Balkans and beyond, and that it did all of this without the structures, kings, armies, monumental temples, that we have come to associate with complexity and power. The painted pottery, spiralling and intricate, is the signature of that achievement. The designs speak, if they speak at all, of a culture that found meaning in pattern, in repetition, in the transformation of clay and fire into something that transcends utility. Standing in a museum in Chisinau or Kyiv, looking at a Cucuteni-Trypillia vessel behind glass, one is struck by the immediacy of the object, by the sense that the hand that shaped it and the mind that conceived its decoration were not so different from our own. The aesthetic choices, the care lavished on an everyday object, the decision to make something beautiful when something merely functional would have sufficed, all of this speaks to a society that valued art, that invested time and skill in the production of objects whose purpose was as much symbolic as practical. And yet, we know so little. We do not know what the spirals meant, if they meant anything beyond their visual effect. We do not know what songs were sung as the vessels were made, what stories were told around the hearths where they were used, what beliefs governed their decoration and their eventual deposition in the earth. The pottery survives, the people who made it do not. And the gap between the object and its makers is a chasm that no amount of analysis can fully bridge. What we can do is document, describe, compare. What we can do is recognize the achievement and honor it by refusing to ignore it, by insisting that this culture, remote in time and space, deserves to be part of the story we tell about our past. The river still runs, the spirals still turn, and the questions unanswered remain. The settlements appeared first as shadows. In the early 1970s, Soviet topographers working across the Ukrainian steppe began to notice something strange in the aerial photographs they were producing for agricultural surveys. Circular patterns, faint but unmistakable, etched into the soil, rings of darker earth arranged in concentric bands around central open spaces, sometimes 2 or 3 rings deep, sometimes 5 or more. The features were enormous, spanning hundreds of hectares, visible only from the air or in the oblique light of early morning when shadows pooled in the ancient depressions. At ground level there was nothing to see. Ploughed fields, pasture, the occasional low-rise or hollow that might have been natural or might have been something else. But from above, the patterns were undeniable. Something vast lay beneath the surface, waiting to be understood. The archaeologists who followed up on these discoveries in the 1970s and 1980s, Ukrainian, Soviet and later German and Moldovan teams, confirmed what the photographs suggested. These were not natural formations. They were the remains of settlements, Neolithic villages on a scale that exceeded anything known from the period anywhere in the world. Magnetometry surveys, which measure subtle variations in the Earth's magnetic field caused by buried structures, revealed the layouts in astonishing detail. Individual houses, arranged in precise rows or concentric rings, hundreds of them, sometimes thousands, clustered together in patterns that spoke of deliberate planning and coordinated construction. The sites belonged to the Cucuteni-Trypillia culture, the same people who'd produced the painted pottery, the same culture that had flourished across the Prut and Dniester river valleys for more than 2 millennia. But these were not villages, these were something else entirely. Taljanki, in the Uman district of central Ukraine, covers between 350 and 450 hectares, depending on how one defines its boundaries. Magnetometry imaging suggests the presence of roughly 2,700 structures, arranged in multiple concentric rings around a central plaza of approximately 25 hectares. Population estimates vary widely. Some scholars propose 6,000 inhabitants, others as many as 15,000 or more, but even the conservative figures place Taljanki among the largest human settlements on Earth in the 5th millennium BC. Majdanetsky, not far to the south, is nearly as large, with close to 3,000 houses mapped across a similar area. Nebelivka, Dobrovody, Taljanki, dozens of other sites, each one a sprawling concentration of humanity, each one predating the rise of the great cities of Mesopotamia and Egypt by 500 to 1,000 years or more. Let that sink in for a moment. The largest human settlements on the planet in their time were not in Sumer or the Nile Delta. They were here, on the Ukrainian steppe, in a culture that has left no written records, no palaces, no monumental temples in stone. Uruk, often cited as the world's first true city, reached its peak around 3500 BC, covering perhaps 400 hectares and housing perhaps 50,000 people at its height. But Uruk had predecessors, and those predecessors had contemporaries, and among those contemporaries were the mega-settlements of the Cucuteni-Trypillia culture, thriving a full millennium earlier. Why are they not more widely known? Why do textbooks on the origins of urbanism begin with Mesopotamia and ignore the evidence from the steppe? Perhaps because these settlements do not fit the narrative. Perhaps because they lack the structures, walls, ziggurats, written administration that we have come to expect from early cities. Perhaps because they were abandoned, burned and forgotten, leaving behind only shadows in the soil and questions that resist easy answers. The internal organisation of these mega-settlements is as puzzling as their scale. Magnetometry reveals a near-mathematical regularity in the placement of houses. At Majdanetsky, structures are arranged in concentric rings, each house roughly the same size. Estimates suggest 70 to 120 square metres for most dwellings, spaced at regular intervals with streets or passageways radiating outward from the central open area. At Taljanki, the pattern is similar, though the outermost rings are less densely packed, and some scholars have suggested that not all structures were occupied simultaneously. Each house, it appears, was a 2-storey wattle and daub building, the lower floor used for storage and daily activities, the upper floor for sleeping and perhaps ritual functions. The uniformity is striking. There are no obvious palaces, no structures that stand out as being significantly larger or more elaborate than their neighbours. There is no monumental temple, no administrative complex, no central storehouse or fortified citadel. The central plaza, vast and open, might have served as a gathering place for festivals, markets or communal rituals, but it bears no evidence of permanent structures. The settlement is, in a sense, radically egalitarian in its physical layout. Everyone lives in a house of similar size, arranged in the same geometric pattern. No one, it seems, is elevated above the rest. How do you organise 10,000 people without a ruler? That question has driven much of the recent research on the Cucuteni-Trypillia mega-settlements, led in part by Johannes Müller of Kiel University, whose long-term collaborative surveys with Ukrainian colleagues have refined our understanding of the site's internal logic. The answer, if there is one, seems to involve forms of social organisation that challenge our assumptions about hierarchy and governance. Miller and his colleagues have proposed a model of peer polity organisation in which multiple autonomous households or lineages cooperate without submitting to a centralised authority. Decision-making in such a model would occur through assembly or consensus, with disputes resolved through negotiation rather than coercion. The absence of prestige goods in the archaeological record, copper objects, spondylus shell ornaments, and other markers of elite status are remarkably rare in the Cucuteni-Trypillia settlements compared to contemporaneous cultures, supports the idea that social stratification was minimal, at least for much of the culture's history. The uniformity of house sizes, the lack of monumental architecture, the distribution of resources, all of this points to a society that actively resisted or perhaps simply did not develop the hierarchies that characterize most other complex societies. But how was it done? How do you coordinate the construction of 2,000 houses, arrange them in concentric rings, manage the labour of thousands of people, organise agricultural production, mediate disputes, maintain social cohesion, all without kings or scribes or bureaucrats? The mechanisms remain elusive. Some scholars have pointed to the possibility of rotating leadership, temporary authority granted to individuals or councils for specific tasks and then relinquished. Others have suggested that kinship structures, extended family networks spanning multiple households, provided the organisational framework. Still others have proposed that ritual and shared cosmology, rather than political authority, held the community together, that participation in communal ceremonies and adherence to shared symbolic systems created a sense of collective identity strong enough to sustain cooperation on a massive scale. The truth is, we do not know. The settlements themselves, silent in the soil, offer few clues. What they do offer is proof that it was possible, that for at least several centuries in the 5th and 4th millennia BC, human societies could achieve urban-scale organisation without the structures that we have come to see as necessary preconditions for complexity. Whether this was stable, whether it was sustainable, whether it could have persisted indefinitely, these are different questions, and the archaeological record, as we shall see, provides troubling answers. Yet even as the peer polity model gained traction in the scholarly literature, new discoveries have begun to complicate the picture. Recent excavations at sites like Stoceni Holm in Romania have identified what some researchers are calling megastructures, buildings significantly larger than the typical dwelling, positioned near the edges of settlements or adjacent to the central plaza. One such structure, excavated in 2023 and 2024, measures approximately 350 square metres, nearly 4 times the median house size. Its function remains uncertain: assembly house, communal storage, ritual centre, but its presence suggests that the egalitarian model, while broadly accurate, may not tell the whole story. Perhaps these were the meeting places where councils convened, where decisions affecting the entire community were debated and made. Perhaps they were the homes of lineage elders, individuals who held authority not through coercion but through respect, age, or ritual knowledge. Perhaps they served functions we cannot yet reconstruct, purposes lost along with the language and beliefs of the people who built them. What is clear is that the mega-settlements were not uniform, that variation existed within and between sites, and that any model of social organisation must account for that variation without collapsing into simplistic narratives of chiefs and subjects, rulers and ruled. And then there is the fire. At dozens of Cucuteni-Trypillia sites, excavation reveals the same pattern. Houses were burned systematically and deliberately from the inside. The roof timbers collapsed inward, the door walls vitrified in the intense heat, the floors covered in layers of ash and charred wood. At Majdanetske, at Taljanki, at Nebelivka, at Bernashivka, at site after site, the evidence is unmistakable. These were not accidental fires. They were not the result of warfare or raid. They were, it seems, intentional, coordinated, a community-wide act of destruction carried out at regular intervals, roughly every 60 to 80 years, after which the population moved on and built a new settlement nearby. The burned house horizon, as it is known in the archaeological literature, is one of the defining features of the Cucuteni-Trypillia culture, and it is also one of the most debated and least understood. Mikhail Videyko, a Ukrainian archaeologist who has spent decades documenting these sites, has been at the forefront of efforts to understand the burning. His work, spanning excavations, surveys and ethno-historical comparisons, has mapped the phenomenon across the culture's entire geographic range and temporal span. The pattern is consistent. Houses were not burned after abandonment. They were burned while still in use, often with valuable objects, pottery, tools, grinding stones, left inside to be consumed by the flames. The fires were intense, reaching temperatures between 750 and 850 degrees Celsius, hot enough to turn the clay daub into a ceramic-like material that preserves the structural outlines in remarkable detail. Experimental archaeology, including a full-scale reconstruction and burning of a Cucuteni-Trypillia house at the Nebelivka site, has confirmed that such fires would have been visible for kilometres, a towering column of smoke and flame, a spectacle that must have drawn the attention of everyone in the surrounding landscape. This was not done quietly, this was not hidden, this was a public act, witnessed, deliberate, and repeated across generations. Why? The theories are numerous, and none fully satisfies. Some scholars have proposed ritual purification, a cyclical cosmology in which houses, like human lives, were believed to have finite lifespans, and burning them was a way to honour that cycle, to return the materials to the earth and the spirits to the ancestors. Others have suggested a form of social reset, a way to prevent the accumulation of wealth or status, to ensure that no family or lineage could become too powerful by maintaining control over land or property across generations. Burn the house, and everyone starts over. Still others have pointed to defensive considerations, a scorched earth strategy to deny resources to raiders or invaders, though the absence of fortifications and weapons in the archaeological record makes this explanation less compelling. More recently, some researchers have explored the possibility that disease played a role, that burning was a response to outbreaks of plague or other infectious diseases, a way to contain contagion and protect the community. Evidence of Yersinia pestis, the bacterium responsible for plague, has been found in ancient DNA samples from the region, though whether it was present during the Cucuteni-Trypillia period and whether it was virulent enough to necessitate such drastic measures remains uncertain. Ruth Tringham and Mirjana Stevanovic have proposed what they call domicide, a term borrowed from studies of modern conflict, but applied here in a ritualistic sense. The deliberate killing of a house, the end of its life as a dwelling, a recognition that structures like people are born, live, and die. In this interpretation, the burning is not destructive but transformative, a way to mark the end of one phase and the beginning of another, to acknowledge that nothing lasts forever and that even the places we call home are temporary. The intensity of the act, the scale of the fire, the completeness of the destruction speaks to the importance of the ritual, to the weight of whatever beliefs or obligations drove the community to undertake it. But ritual does not explain everything. Why every 60 to 80 years? Why not more frequently or less? Why burn the entire settlement, hundreds or thousands of houses rather than individual dwellings as needed? Why move to a new location rather than rebuild on the same spot? The pattern suggests coordination, planning, a collective decision made at a specific moment and carried out with precision. It suggests that the burning was tied to something beyond individual houses, something that affected the community as a whole. Perhaps it was demographic. Once the population reached a certain size, resources became strained, social tensions mounted, and the decision was made to disperse, to split into smaller groups and start fresh. Perhaps it was environmental. Soil depletion, deforestation, the overgrazing of pasture, all the cumulative effects of intensive agriculture and dense settlement, reaching a tipping point that made relocation necessary. Perhaps it was cosmological, a calendar tied to celestial events, to the alignment of stars or the cycles of the moon, dictating when the time had come to let go and begin again. We do not know. What we do know is that the burning was not a one-time event. It happened again and again, across centuries, across the entire geographic range of the culture. It was, in some sense, a defining practice, as characteristic of the Cucuteni-Trypillia culture as the painted pottery, as the mega-settlements themselves. And it leaves us with an image, vivid and unsettling. A settlement of 10,000 people, thousands of houses arranged in perfect rings, all set alight on the same day, the flames leaping skyward, the heat intense enough to melt the walls, the smoke visible for tens of kilometres in every direction. What must it have been like to stand there, to watch your home burn, to know that everything you had built, everything you had worked for was being consumed, and to accept it, to participate in it, because the community had decided that this was necessary, that this was right. What kind of belief system, what kind of social contract makes such an act possible? The question lingers. The fires are long cold, the ashes scattered, the people who lit them gone. But the burned house horizon remains, a layer of charred earth and vitrified clay, a testament to decisions we cannot fully understand, and to a way of life that challenges everything we think we know about how human societies organize themselves, how they grow, and how they choose to end. The journey south from the Ukrainian steppe takes us away from the circular settlements, away from the burned horizons and the questions they leave unanswered, and toward the edge of the Black Sea. The land changes as we move. The open grasslands give way to rolling hills, to forests of oak and beech, to the scent of salt carried inland on the wind. The Danube basin and its tributaries have been our guide thus far. But now we turn toward the coast, toward a place where the story shifts, where the material world suddenly becomes richer, stranger, and where the social fabric of old Europe begins to show its first unmistakable tears. We are moving toward Varna, toward a necropolis discovered by accident in 1972, toward the oldest worked gold ever found, toward graves that contain more wealth than the combined archaeological record of the entire rest of the world for that epoch. And we are moving, though we do not yet see it, toward the first clear evidence that the egalitarian dream of the Danube basin, the consensus-driven mega-settlements, the peer polity networks, the communities without kings or palaces, was already beginning to fracture. The discovery came in October 1972 in the western industrial zone of the Bulgarian city of Varna, a port on the Black Sea coast. An excavator operator named Rachel Marinov was digging a trench for an electrical cable. Routine work, the blade of the machine biting into the earth when he struck something that should not have been there, metal glinting in the soil. He stopped the machine, climbed down, and began to dig by hand. What he pulled from the earth was a bracelet, heavy, yellow, unmistakably gold. Over the following hours and days he found more. Beads, rings, small ornaments, all gold, all ancient, all clustered in a patch of earth no larger than a grave. Marinov collected the objects, took them home, and stored them in a shoebox with his boots for several weeks before handing them over to Dimitar Zlatarski, curator of the Dalgopol Historical Museum. Zlatarski recognized what they were, and within months, formal excavations had begun. Over the next 13 seasons, from 1972 to 1991, archaeologists directed by Mikhail Lazarov and Ivan Ivanov uncovered 294 graves, a necropolis dating to roughly 4600 to 4200 BC, a cemetery of the late Chalcolithic, the Copper Age, the same broad epoch as the Cucuteni-Trypillia culture to the north. But the graves at Varna were different. They contained gold, more than 3,000 objects totaling over 6 kilograms, more gold than had been found in all other archaeological sites worldwide from that period combined. The sheer anachronism of it is staggering. This is not a handful of beads, not a few ornaments scattered across a culture area. This is smelted gold, worked gold, gold hammered into sheets and cut into discs, gold wrapped around handles and sewn onto garments, gold shaped into diadems and armlets and masks. This is wealth on a scale that should not exist, not here, not yet, not in a society that was supposed to be simple, egalitarian, Neolithic in character if not strictly in name. Who are the people who made this? The graves tell us some things. The necropolis was used by a settled community, likely the inhabitants of a nearby tell or cluster of villages, people who farmed, who herded animals, who fished the rivers and the sea. The pottery found in the graves is high quality, burnished, some of it painted with gold pigment, a technique that speaks to both technical skill and symbolic intent. There are copper tools, axes, chisels, blades, and flint and obsidian worked into long, elegant forms, some of them exceeding 40 centimeters in length, too large and too fine to be purely utilitarian. There are shells, hundreds of them, Mediterranean spondylus shells, pierced and strung as beads or used as decorative inlays, evidence of trade networks stretching across the sea. There are ceramic figurines, zoomorphic and anthropomorphic, the same kinds of figures found at Vinča and Plochnik, the same iconographic language that runs through old Europe from the Adriatic to the Carpathians. And there is gold. In nearly every grave there is gold, though not in equal measure. Some burials contain a few beads, a bracelet, a ring. Others contain hundreds of objects, thousands of individual pieces, arranged on the body, woven into the clothing, placed at the hands and feet and head. The disparity is stark, it is intentional, and it marks, for the first time in the documentary's arc, the clear and undeniable emergence of hierarchy. The richest burial in the necropolis, and one of the richest prehistoric burials ever excavated anywhere on Earth, is known as Grave 43. It lies near the centre of the cemetery, a simple rectangular pit cut into the earth, roughly 2 meters long and 1 meter wide, oriented east-west like most of the other graves. Inside lay the skeleton of a male individual, estimated to have been in his mid-40s, perhaps older, tall for the time at roughly 170 to 172 centimeters, his bones showing signs of wear consistent with a lifetime of physical activity, but no evidence of violent trauma. He was buried on his back, arms at his sides, legs extended, the position conventional for the culture. What was not conventional was what lay with him. 990 gold objects, a gold diadem encircling the skull, gold armlets on both wrists, gold rings on the fingers, hundreds of gold beads sewn onto the clothing covering the torso and limbs in a shimmering second skin. A gold sheath, tubular, found in the pelvic region, historically described as a penis sheath, though recent analysis suggests it may have been a decorative belt element or costume piece, the exact function ambiguous but the symbolic weight unmistakable. At the right shoulder, a copper axe, its handle wrapped in gold foil, a scepter, an object that combines the practical and the ceremonial, a tool and a symbol of authority. Near the head, a massive flint blade, over 40 centimeters long, polished to a mirror finish, far too fragile and far too beautiful to have been used for anything but display. And scattered throughout the grave, gold discs, gold appliques, gold fragments that once adorned a garment or a shroud, their exact arrangement lost to time but their presence overwhelming. The weight of gold in Grave 43 exceeds 1.5 kilograms. The number of individual objects is 990. This single grave contained more gold than the combined total found in the entire rest of the world for that epoch. Ivan Ivanov, the Bulgarian archaeologist who led the excavations, described it as evidence of an achieved, possibly hereditary elite status, the earliest clear archaeological proof of a class-segregated society in Europe. The implications are profound. The Cucuteni-Trypillia mega-settlements, the Vinča culture villages, the geometric precision of Lepenski Vir, all of these had suggested complex social organization, sophisticated planning, networks of cooperation and exchange. But they had not shown this. They had not shown a single individual buried with more wealth than entire communities, buried in a way that declares unambiguously that some lives were worth more than others, that some roles carried power that extended beyond death. Grave 43 is not an anomaly. 4 other graves in the Varna necropolis, graves 1, 4, 36 and 41, contain similarly vast quantities of gold, and together these 5 burials account for more than 80% of the total gold found at the site. The pattern is clear. A small number of individuals controlled or had access to a disproportionate share of the community's wealth, and that wealth was considered important enough, sacred enough, or politically necessary enough to be buried with them rather than redistributed. The axe scepter, found in several of the richest graves, has been interpreted as a symbol of authority, possibly secular, possibly religious, possibly both. The combination of copper and gold, of the practical and the precious, suggests a leader who was also a warrior, a mediator, a person whose role encompassed multiple spheres of communal life. Whether this authority was achieved through personal prowess, inherited through lineage, or granted by consensus or divine mandate, we cannot say, but it existed, it was real, and it was expressed, publicly and permanently, through burial. The gold itself raises questions. Where did it come from? Gold is not abundant in the region, not in the form of large, easily accessible deposits. The metal likely came from alluvial sources, small particles washed down from mountain ranges to the south and west, panned from riverbeds and streams in quantities measured in grams, not kilograms. The effort required to accumulate 6 kilograms of gold, to smelt it, to work it into thousands of individual objects is staggering. It implies generations of collection, specialized labor, controlled access to resources and to the knowledge of metallurgy. It implies trade networks capable of moving raw materials across hundreds of kilometers, and it implies a social structure capable of organising and sustaining that trade. Metallurgical analysis has revealed that the Varna culture utilised a standardised system of weights, minimal units identified at roughly 0.14 grams and 0.40 grams, suggesting that gold was measured, valued and possibly exchanged according to consistent rules. This is not casual ornamentation. This is a commodity, a store of value, a medium of exchange or display that was understood and recognised across a wide geographic area. The presence of espondylus shells in the graves supports this interpretation. These shells, harvested from the Aegean and Mediterranean seas, have been found at Neolithic and Chalcolithic sites across Europe, often in ritual or high-status contexts, and have been interpreted by some researchers as a form of primitive currency or a marker of participation in long-distance exchange networks. At Varna, the shells are abundant, pierced, strung, incorporated into necklaces and garments, a visual language of connection and wealth that complements the gold. But the most unsettling graves at Varna are not the richest, they are the empty ones. Among the 294 excavated burials, a significant subset contains no human remains. These are cenotaphs, symbolic graves, furnished with full sets of grave goods, pottery, tools, ornaments, gold, but no body. The grave goods are arranged as if a person were present, laid out in the position the skeleton would occupy, but the earth is empty. In 3 of these cenotaphs, life-sized anthropomorphic masks made of unbaked clay have been found, positioned where the head of the deceased would have been. The masks are crude in form, simple rounded shapes with minimal facial features, eyes and a mouth indicated by shallow depressions, the clay unworked, unglazed, left to dry in the open air rather than fired in a kiln. They are fragile, temporary, and yet they were placed with care, accompanied by gold, by copper, by the same array of objects found in the richest inhumation graves. Who are these absent dead? The conventional interpretation is that they represent individuals who died away from the community, at sea, in distant lands, in circumstances that made the recovery of the body impossible or impractical. The Varna culture was connected to maritime and long-distance trade networks. The presence of spondylus shells, obsidian from Anatolia, and copper from inland sources confirms this. It is not unreasonable to imagine that some members of the community travelled, that some did not return, and that their families or their community chose to honour them with a symbolic burial, a place in the necropolis even though the body could not be brought home. But the masks complicate this. Why a mask? Why unbaked clay, a material that will crumble, that was never meant to last? The mask is a stand-in, a representation, an acknowledgement that the person is absent but not forgotten. It is a way to give form to the invisible, to create a presence where there is none. And it foreshadows, by thousands of years, the gold funerary masks of Mycenaean Greece, the death masks of later civilizations that sought to preserve the face, the identity, the memory of the dead. The cenotaphs raise questions about memory, about identity, about the social function of mortuary ritual in a society that was beginning, for the first time, to stratify. If Grave 43 and the other elite burials demonstrate the emergence of hierarchy, the cenotaphs demonstrate the expansion of community beyond the physically present. The act of creating a grave for someone who is not there is an act of imagination, of belief, an assertion that the community includes not only the living and the dead who can be buried, but also the dead who cannot, the lost, the absent, the remembered. It is a way to maintain social bonds across distance and across death, to insist that a person who died far away still belongs, still has a place, still deserves to be honoured. And it is a way to manage grief, to give closure, to perform the rituals that mark the end of a life even when the body is beyond reach. The masks, fragile and temporary, embody this paradox. They stand in for the absent, but they are themselves impermanent, destined to decay, a reminder that the dead are gone and that memory, like the mask, is fragile. The Varna necropolis was in use for several centuries, from roughly 4600 to 4200 BC, a span of time that saw the culture flourish, and then, like so many others in the region, decline and disappear. By 4000 BC, the necropolis had been abandoned. The practice of burying the dead with gold had ceased, and the coastal settlements that sustained the culture had faded or been absorbed into other traditions. What happened is not entirely clear. There is no evidence of invasion, no burned layers, no mass graves, no signs of violence. The decline appears to have been gradual, a slow contraction of trade networks, a dispersal of population, a shift in resources or priorities that made the old ways unsustainable. But the legacy of Varna is undeniable. The gold, the cenotaphs, the axe scepters, the stratified burials, all of these mark a turning point, a moment when the social fabric of old Europe began to change, when the egalitarian structures that had characterized the Danube basin for millennia began to give way to something else, something more hierarchical, more unequal, more recognizable to us as the foundation of what would later become civilization. Standing at the edge of the Black Sea, looking out over the water toward the distant horizons where the spondylus shells and the obsidian and the copper came from, one cannot help but feel the weight of what was lost and what was gained. The gold is beautiful, the craftsmanship extraordinary, the evidence of trade and connection and human ingenuity undeniable. But it is also the evidence of division, of power concentrated in the hands of a few, of a world where not everyone was equal, where some were buried with gold and some were not, where the very act of burial became a statement of status, of worth, of belonging. The Varna necropolis is a threshold, a place where the old Europe of the river valleys and the mega-settlements begins to encounter forces that will ultimately transform it. Forces from within and from without, forces of ambition, of wealth, of hierarchy, of the slow but inexorable shift toward the world we recognize as history. The gold at Varna is the oldest ever found, but it is not the beginning of metallurgy in the region. That began earlier, in the Danube basin, at Vinča and Pločnik, in the simple copper tools and ornaments that predated the Bronze Age. Varna is where metallurgy became wealth, where metal became power, where the material and the social began to intertwine in ways that could not be undone. And the cenotaphs, with their clay masks and their absent bodies, remind us that this was also a culture that valued memory, that honoured the dead even when they could not be present, that understood that identity and belonging were not solely tied to the physical body, but to something more, something carried in the minds and hearts of the living. What did they believe? What stories did they tell about the man in grave 43, about the people honoured in the cenotaphs, about the gold and the copper and the shells that came from distant seas? We do not know. The Varna culture left no writing, no inscriptions, no texts to explain their beliefs or their social structures. We have only the graves, the objects, the bones, the patterns of placement and association that archaeologists painstakingly reconstruct. We have the gold, radiant and silent, waiting in the earth for 5,000 years before a man digging a trench for a cable brought it back into the light. And we have the questions, endless and unanswered, about how a society organized itself, how it valued its members, how it chose to remember its dead, and how it laid the groundwork, intentionally or not, for the hierarchies and the inequalities that would shape the millennia to come. The gold at Varna did not appear from nowhere. It was the culmination of something older, something broader, something woven across the entire Balkan peninsula and beyond, a web of exchange and expertise that stretched from the Aegean to the Carpathians, from the Black Sea coast inland to the very heart of the Danube basin. To understand how a small coastal necropolis came to hold more gold than all other contemporary sites combined, we must step back and trace the threads of that web, the networks of copper and shell and stone that bound old Europe into a single, interconnected economic world. The story begins not with gold but with copper, and not at Varna but deep in the mountains of southern Bulgaria, at a place called Bunar. Bunar lies in the Sredna Gora range, a low chain of forested hills rising between the Thracian plain and the higher peaks of the Balkan range to the north. The landscape is rugged, scarred by erosion, punctuated by outcrops of greenish stone where copper, carbonates, malachite and azurite oxidize at the surface in vivid streaks of colour. It is not an easy place to work, not an easy place to live, but by the late 6th millennium BC, people were coming here, digging into the hillsides, extracting ore in quantities that far exceeded anything previously known in Europe. The mines at Bunar represent one of the earliest large-scale industrial operations in human history, predating the Great Bronze Age mines of Cyprus and Anatolia by more than 1,000 years. The trenches are shallow, following the seams of ore along the surface, narrow open cuts extending for dozens of meters, widening where the deposit was rich, tapering where it thinned. The miners used antler picks and stone mauls, tools that seem crude to us but were remarkably effective, capable of breaking through friable rock and extracting ore in manageable chunks. The scale of the operation is difficult to grasp without standing there, without seeing the extent of the disturbance, the sheer volume of earth moved by hand over centuries. Thousands of tons of ore were taken from Ibunar during the 5th and 4th millennia BC, processed into ingots and traded across the region, feeding the workshops at Vinča, at Pločnik, at Varna, at settlements whose names we no longer know. How do we know this? How can we trace a piece of copper from a mine in Bulgaria to a grave on the Black Sea coast, across 5,000 years and hundreds of kilometers? The answer lies in the metal itself, in the invisible signature left by the ore. Copper is not chemically pure. It carries trace elements, isotopes of lead and other metals that vary depending on the geological source. In the 1980s and 1990s, archaeologist Ernst Pernicka, working first in Germany and later in Austria, began systematically analysing copper artefacts from across the Balkans using lead isotope and trace element techniques. The results were revelatory. Objects from widely separated sites from Serbia to Romania to Bulgaria shared chemical signatures that pointed back to a small number of ore sources, including Ibunar. The copper was moving, not sporadically or haphazardly, but along established routes, through networks of exchange that linked communities across the entire region. The Danube basin was not isolated. It was not a backwater. It was the hub of a continental system, a crossroads where raw materials and finished goods flowed in multiple directions, where knowledge and craft and innovation were shared, where the boundaries between cultures were porous and the connections between settlements were strong. Pernicka's work demonstrated, in a way that archaeology alone could not, that old Europe was economically integrated, that the people of Vinča and Varna and the Cucuteni-Trypillia settlements were participants in a common world, bound together by the exchange of materials and the interdependence that such exchange creates. Copper was only one thread in the web. Equally important and equally far-travelled were the spondylus shells, the deep red thorny oyster shells that appear in graves and middens across the Danube basin from around 5500 BC onward. Spondylus gederopus is a Mediterranean species. It does not live in the Black Sea, does not live in rivers or lakes. It is found only in the warm saline waters of the Aegean, the Adriatic and the Western Mediterranean, attached to rocks in shallow coastal zones. To acquire spondylus, one had to travel to the sea or trade with someone who did. The shells were prized for their colour and their rarity, worked into beads and bracelets and pendants, buried with the dead as markers of wealth, or status or connection. At Varna, dozens of graves contained spondylus ornaments, some carved into intricate shapes, some left whole and strung on cords. At Vinča, at Pločnik, at sites across Serbia and Romania and Hungary, spondylus appears in the same contexts associated with burials, with hoards, with deposits that suggest ritual or symbolic significance. The distribution of spondylus maps the reach of the exchange networks, tracing routes that ran from the Aegean coast north along the river valleys, up the Vardar and the Morava, across the passes of the Carpathians, into the heart of the Pannonian plain. It was a journey of hundreds of kilometres, through territories controlled by different communities, speaking different languages, practicing different customs. Yet the shells moved, passed from hand to hand, village to village, generation to generation, until they arrived in places that had never seen the sea. Places where the shells must have seemed like objects from another world, radiant and strange and impossibly distant. Obsidian, too, was part of the web. Volcanic glass from the Aegean island of Melos and from sources in central Anatolia has been identified at Balkan sites dating to the 7th and 6th millennia BC. Evidence of maritime trade that predates the rise of the Great Bronze Age civilizations by thousands of years. Obsidian is brittle and difficult to work, but when knapped correctly it produces edges sharper than any metal, blades that could be used for butchering, for surgery, for cutting hides and reeds and wood. It was valuable not only for its utility, but for its appearance, the glossy black or banded grey surface that caught the light, the sense of craft and precision it embodied. Like Spondylus, obsidian moved long distances, carried by traders or passed along exchange routes that linked the coasts to the interior. The presence of Aegean obsidian at Danube basin sites is evidence that the networks were not one-way, that materials flowed in multiple directions, that the people of old Europe were not passive recipients of goods from more advanced neighbours, but active participants in a reciprocal system of exchange. What held this system together? There were no states, no centralised administrations, no written contracts or enforced trade agreements. The exchange networks of old Europe operated without the structures that we associate with civilization, without kings or bureaucracies or standing armies. Yet they functioned, and they functioned for millennia, sustaining connections across vast distances, maintaining flows of copper and shell and obsidian and pottery and grain and livestock and knowledge. The answer, perhaps, lies in the nature of the societies themselves, in the egalitarian or near-egalitarian structures that characterise the Danube basin settlements for most of the Neolithic. When status is not rigidly fixed, when wealth is not hoarded, when communities are organised around kinship and reciprocity, rather than hierarchy and coercion, the incentive to trade is not profit but relationship, the maintenance of alliances, the obligations of gift and counter-gift that bind people together across space and time. The copper from Ibunar, the spondylus from the Aegean, the obsidian from Melos, these were not commodities in the modern sense. They were tokens of connection, embodiments of social contracts, material expressions of networks that were as much about identity and belonging as they were about the movement of goods. To wear a spondylus bracelet was to signal participation in that network, to mark oneself as part of a world that extended far beyond the village, the valley, the immediate horizon. To be buried with copper tools and gold ornaments was to carry those connections into the afterlife, to affirm that identity and status were relational, embedded in webs of exchange that transcended the individual, but the web was under pressure. By 3500 BC, the networks that had sustained old Europe for 2,000 years were beginning to fray. The evidence comes from multiple sources, from shifts in the archaeological record, from changes in settlement patterns, from the appearance of new material cultures in regions that had been stable for centuries. And increasingly, the evidence comes from a source that did not exist when Maria Gimbutas first proposed her model of old Europe, a source that has transformed our understanding of the late Neolithic in ways that are still being debated and digested: ancient DNA. To the east of the Carpathians, beyond the forests and the river valleys of the Danube basin, lies the steppe. It is a different world, vast and open, stretching from the Black Sea to the Urals, from the foothills of the Caucasus to the taiga of Siberia. It is a grassland, windswept and arid, too dry for agriculture in most places, too flat and exposed for the kind of settled village life that characterized old Europe. But by the late 5th millennium BC, people were living there, not in villages but in camps, moving with herds of cattle and sheep and goats, exploiting the seasonal grasses, ranging across territories measured in hundreds of kilometres, rather than the few square kilometres that bounded the world of the farmer. These were the pastoralists of the Pontic-Caspian steppe, and by 3500 BC they had developed a suite of technologies and practices that gave them a mobility and a reach that no settled agricultural society could match. They had domesticated the horse, or were in the process of doing so, harnessing it not yet for riding in the full sense but for traction, for pulling sledges and perhaps wheeled vehicles. They had developed the kurgan, the earthen burial mound that would become the defining feature of steppe mortuary practice for the next 3 millennia, a monument visible for kilometres across the flat grassland, a marker of territory and lineage and power. And they had begun to move, not in the slow generational drift that characterised earlier migrations, but in waves, expansions driven by the advantages of mobility, by the ability to exploit resources that settled farmers could not, by the pressures of climate and population, and the logic of pastoral economics. This was the Yamnaya culture, named for the Russian word yama, meaning pit, a reference to the burial chambers sunk beneath the kurgans. And their expansion would change the genetic map of Europe. In 2015, a team led by Wolfgang Haak and David Reich published a landmark study in the journal Nature, analysing genome-wide data from 69 ancient Europeans spanning the Neolithic and Bronze Age, The results were startling. Late Neolithic populations in Central and Northern Europe, associated with the corded ware culture, derived approximately 75% of their ancestry from a population closely related to the Yamnaya of the Pontic-Caspian steppe. This was not gradual admixture, not the slow blending of populations over centuries. It was a massive demographic replacement, a surge of steppe ancestry into regions that had been occupied by settled farmers for thousands of years. In some areas, including Britain, incoming groups replaced up to 90% of the local Neolithic gene pool within a few hundred years. The genetic signal was unmistakable, and it aligned with archaeological evidence for the spread of new material cultures, new burial practices, new ways of life that moved from the steppe westward across Europe, starting around 3000 BC. The implications were profound. For decades, archaeologists had debated the mechanisms of cultural change in prehistory, the relative importance of migration versus diffusion, of invasion versus acculturation. The DNA settled the question, at least in this case. The spread of corded ware and related cultures was not the spread of ideas. It was the spread of people, steppe pastoralists moving into Europe, mixing with local populations in some regions, replacing them in others, carrying with them not only their material culture, but their genes, their languages, their cosmologies. The Yamnaya themselves were an admixed population, combining ancestry from Eastern European hunter-gatherers and populations from the Caucasus or Near East. They were not a pure race, not an ancient people, but the product of earlier encounters, earlier mixtures, earlier migrations that played out across the steppe in the millennia before they expanded westward. But by 3500 BC, they were distinct genetically and culturally from the settled farmers of old Europe, and their expansion brought them into contact, and eventually into conflict, with the communities of the Danube basin and the Balkans. Did old Europe die violently? Did the Yamnaya sweep down from the steppe with horses and weapons, burning villages, displacing populations, imposing a new order by force? Or was the transition peaceful, a gradual assimilation, a blending of cultures and genes driven by intermarriage and trade and the slow erosion of old identities? The answer is almost certainly somewhere in between, and it varied from place to place, from region to region, depending on local circumstances, on the balance of power, on the choices made by individuals and communities in the face of change. There is evidence of increased violence in the archaeological record of the late Neolithic, of fortifications appearing where none had existed before, of mass graves and burned settlements and signs of trauma on skeletal remains. But there is also evidence of continuity, of local populations persisting alongside newcomers, of mixed material cultures that suggest coexistence rather than replacement. The DNA shows the outcome, a massive influx of steppe ancestry, but it does not tell us how it felt, what it meant to the people who lived through it, whether they experienced it as conquest or opportunity or something more ambiguous. What is clear is that the world of old Europe, the world of Vinča and Varna, and the Cucuteni-Trypillia mega-settlements was under pressure from the east, from the steppe, from a way of life that was fundamentally different, more mobile, more hierarchical, more oriented toward herding and raiding and the accumulation of portable wealth, and at the same time it was under pressure from within, from the ecological and social stresses that come with intensive agriculture, with population growth, with the exploitation of landscapes at the edge of their carrying capacity. Nowhere is this more visible than in the late phases of the Cucuteni-Trypillia culture, in the centuries after 3800 BC, when the mega-settlements that had dominated the Ukrainian and Moldovan forest steppe began to falter. The signs are subtle at first, shifts in settlement patterns, changes in the frequency of the burning episodes, evidence from environmental records that suggest the land itself was being pushed to its limits. Pollen cores taken from lakes and wetlands in the region show a dramatic decline in tree cover during the late Neolithic, a progressive deforestation driven by the need for timber and fuel and agricultural land. Forests that had covered the landscape for millennia were cleared, converted into fields and pastures, leaving behind a more open, more fragile environment. With the trees gone, the soil eroded more easily, washed into the rivers during heavy rains, leaving behind gullies and badlands where once there had been rich bottomland. Game populations collapsed as the forest shrank. The aurochs, the red deer, the wild boar that had provided supplementary protein and raw materials for the early farming communities became scarce, forcing the inhabitants of the mega-settlements to rely more heavily on domesticated animals, on cattle and pigs and sheep that had to be fed from the same diminishing resource base. Agricultural yields, already under pressure from soil depletion and erosion, may have declined further, requiring more land to produce the same amount of grain, pushing the clearances outward in a cycle that was ultimately unsustainable. Archaeologist Biserka Gajdarska, whose work at the Nebelivka megasite has been instrumental in reconstructing the social and ecological dynamics of the Cucuteni-Trypillia world, has modelled how such a community might have functioned at the edge of its carrying capacity. Nebelivka, at its peak around 4000 BC, covered more than 200 hectares and contained perhaps 1,500 structures, housing a population that may have reached 3,000 or more. Feeding that many people required an enormous agricultural hinterland, fields extending for kilometres in every direction, grazing lands for the herds, forests for fuel and timber. Gajdarska's landscape studies suggest that the settlement was operating at or near the maximum sustainable population for the local environment, that any further growth would have required either expansion into new territories or intensification of production, both of which carried risks. Expansion brought the community into competition with neighbours, potentially leading to conflict over resources, over boundaries, over access to grazing lands and water sources. Intensification meant working the land harder, shortening fallow periods, planting more marginal soils, strategies that produce short-term gains but long-term degradation. The system was balanced on a knife's edge, dependent on favourable weather, on the continued cooperation of a large and diverse population, on the maintenance of exchange networks that could buffer against local shortfalls. Any disruption, any shock to the system, climate, disease, social conflict, could push it over the edge. And the disruptions came. The burning episodes, the ritualized destruction of entire settlements that had characterized the Cucuteni-Trypillia culture from its earliest phases, became more frequent in the late period. Houses that once stood for 60 or 80 years before being burned were now being destroyed after shorter intervals, suggesting that the cycles of renewal and regeneration that had structured the society were accelerating, possibly in response to mounting pressures. Were the burnings still ritual, still voluntary acts of communal transformation, or had they become something else, responses to crises, to disease outbreaks, to resource failures, to social conflicts that could no longer be contained? The archaeology cannot answer that question with certainty, but the pattern is clear. The mega-settlements, which had grown steadily larger and more elaborate over the course of 1,000 years, stopped growing. By 3600 BC, new megasites were no longer being founded. The existing ones began to shrink, their populations dispersing, their networks contracting. Some were abandoned entirely, left to decay without the final conflagration that had marked the end of earlier phases. Others persisted, but in diminished form, smaller, less densely populated, less connected to the wider world. Excavations at the Kosinivka site, dating to around 3700 to 3600 BC, revealed something even more troubling: evidence of violence. 7 individuals buried in a midden context rather than in formal graves showed signs of perimortem cranial trauma, blows to the head delivered at or near the time of death. This was not the careful, reverent burial that characterized earlier Cucuteni-Trypillia mortuary practice. This was disposal, the hurried interment of bodies in a time of crisis, a snapshot of a community under stress. Violence, though still rare in the overall record, was becoming more common, a sign that the social fabric that had held these large egalitarian communities together for so long was beginning to tear. Inequality too was rising. Analysis of house sizes across 38 settlements and some 7,000 structures shows that, while the society remained relatively egalitarian by later standards, disparities in wealth and status began to increase after 3800 BC, peaking after 3750 BC as the megasite system entered its final phase. The uniformity that had characterized the earlier settlements, the sense that all households were roughly equal, was giving way to differentiation, to the emergence of larger houses, more elaborate structures, possible assembly buildings like the massive 350 square metre structure excavated at Cucuteni-Holm, which suggests that some form of centralisation, some concentration of authority or ritual function, was beginning to develop in response to the mounting challenges. The question that hangs over all of this is, why? Why did the mega-settlements fail? Why did a system that had worked for 1,000 years, that had sustained populations in the tens of thousands, that had created the largest communities on Earth at that time, suddenly buckle and collapse? The answer is not simple, and it is not singular. It was not one thing, but many things. A convergence of ecological, social, and external pressures that together overwhelmed the resilience of the system. The land was exhausted, the forest cleared, the soils eroded, the game gone. The climate may have shifted, becoming drier or more variable, making agriculture more precarious. Disease may have played a role. Recent genetic studies have identified Yersinia pestis, the bacterium that causes plague, in European populations dating to the late Neolithic, raising the possibility that epidemic disease swept through the crowded mega-settlements, forcing the survivors to abandon or burn their homes in an effort to contain the contagion. And from the east, from the steppe, new peoples were coming, peoples with different technologies, different social structures, different ways of organizing power and wealth, peoples who would, within a few centuries, transform the genetic and cultural landscape of Europe. The web that had sustained old Europe was breaking. The networks of copper and shell and obsidian, the reciprocal exchange systems that had linked communities across the Balkans and the Danube basin for 2 millennia, were contracting, becoming more localized, less reliable. The great mining operations at Ibunar continued, but the distribution of copper narrowed, concentrated in fewer hands, circulating within smaller, more hierarchical societies. The spondylus trade declined, the shells becoming rarer in inland sites, a sign that the long-distance routes were no longer functioning as they once had. The mega-settlements of the Cucuteni-Trypillia culture, the egalitarian cities that had no precedent and would have no successor for 1,000 years, were abandoned, their inhabitants dispersing into smaller villages, into a landscape that was emptier, more fragmented, more uncertain. And in the kurgans rising on the steppe, in the graves of the Amnia chieftains buried with ochre and bronze and the bones of horses, we see the future taking shape, a future of hierarchy, of mobility, of languages and genes and material cultures that would spread across Europe and erase much of what had come before. The web that made Varna possible was unravelling, thread by thread, and the world it had sustained was beginning to fall apart. The symbols did not vanish all at once. They persisted, scattered across the final decades of the old European world, etched into pottery and pressed into clay in the settlements that still clung to the old ways even as the fabric around them frayed. In some places, particularly in Transylvania and along the middle Danube, the marks grew more complex, more deliberate, arranged in sequences that looked, to modern eyes accustomed to reading, less like decoration and more like structured communication, as though the people who made them were striving towards something, reaching for a threshold they would never cross. These terminal inscriptions, the last transmissions of a symbolic tradition that stretched back more than a millennium, carry a weight that transcends their physical form. They feel, in retrospect, like the final words of a language spoken by a culture about to go silent. In September 1961, a team led by Romanian archaeologist Nicolae Vlasa unearthed 3 small clay tablets at a Neolithic site near the town of Târtăria, roughly 30 kilometers from Alba Iulia in Transylvania. The tablets were found in what Vlasa described as a ritual pit, a shallow depression containing 26 clay and stone figurines, a shell bracelet, and the disarticulated burnt bones of a human individual estimated to have been between 35 and 40 years old at death, a person who came to be known in the literature with a mixture of reverence and irony as Milady Târtăria. The tablets themselves were small, approximately 6 centimeters in diameter, 2 rectangular and 1 round, each inscribed on a single face with symbols that resembled, strikingly, unmistakably, the Vinča signs found across the Balkans, but also in certain arrangements and forms, the archaic proto-cuneiform tablets recovered from the Sumerian city of Uruk, far to the southeast in Mesopotamia. The material was a mixture of clay, sand, and quicklime, unbaked at the time of discovery, and museum staff subsequently baked the tablets for preservation, a well-intentioned act that rendered direct radiocarbon dating impossible and ensured that the question of their age would remain contentious for decades. Vlasa initially associated the tablets with the Vinča Turdush culture, which would place them around 2700 BC, comfortably later than the earlier Sumerian writing, yet indirect radiocarbon evidence from the surrounding strata suggested a much earlier date, around 5300 BC, 2 millennia before the scribes of Uruk pressed their reed styluses into soft clay to record livestock and grain. If that date were correct, if the Trypillia tablets truly belonged to the 6th millennium before Christ, then they would represent the oldest known attempt at writing in human history, a profound disruption of the narrative that places the invention of literacy firmly in Mesopotamia, in the urban centres of the Fertile Crescent, among the accountants and priests of Sumer. The controversy ignited immediately and has never been fully resolved. Some scholars argue that the tablets are an intrusion, displaced from a later layer by disturbance or erosion, their apparent early date an artifact of flawed stratigraphy. Others maintain that the context is sound, that the association with the burnt bones and the ritual assemblage is genuine, and that the symbols represent a true if limited writing system developed independently in the Balkans. Still others occupy a middle ground, suggesting that the Trypillia signs are proto-writing, a system of symbolic communication that encodes information but does not represent spoken language, a halfway house between pictography and phonetic script, a threshold approached but never crossed. Standing before the tablets in the museum cases where they now rest, one is struck by their smallness, by the intimacy of the act that produced them. The symbols are carefully incised, arranged in columns and rows, some abstract, some pictographic, shapes that might represent animals, plants, tools, numbers, concepts we can no longer name. The round tablet bears a cross dividing its surface into quadrants, with additional marks clustered within each section, a layout that suggests organisation, intentionality, structure. The rectangular tablets carry linear sequences, signs that follow one another in a way that invites reading, though whether they should be read from left to right, top to bottom, or in some other order entirely remains unknown. Were these ownership marks claiming the goods buried with Milady Trypillia as her own? Were they ritual texts, prayers, or invocations meant to guide the deceased through the journey beyond death? Were they astronomical records, calendrical notations, accounts of debts or tribute, the mundane ledgers of a farming community? Or were they something else? Something we have no category for, a mode of symbolic thought that operated according to principles we can no longer reconstruct. The tablets do not answer. They sit in their cases, silent witnesses to a practice that ended before it could fully articulate itself, before it could leave behind enough evidence for us to decode its grammar and reconstruct its voice. The Vinča symbol system, of which the Trypillia tablets are the most famous and most controversial examples, comprises more than 700 distinct marks recorded across some 150 sites in modern-day Serbia, Romania, Bulgaria, Hungary, Moldova and Ukraine. The signs appear on pottery, on figurines, on loom weights and spindle whorls, on the everyday objects of domestic life as well as on items that seem to carry ritual or ceremonial significance. They span a geographic range that stretches from the iron gates of the Danube to the Carpathian foothills, from the plains of the Tisza to the shores of the Black Sea, a territory larger than many ancient empires, and they persist across more than a millennium, from roughly 5500 BC to 3500 BC, outlasting individual settlements, individual cultures, individual generations of makers. Some proponents of what has come to be called the Danube script theory argue that this consistency, this standardization across time and space, suggests a true writing system, a shared code understood and employed by communities separated by hundreds of kilometers and centuries of elapsed time. They point to the linear arrangements of symbols on certain artifacts, to the apparent repetition of specific signs in similar contexts, to the sheer number and diversity of marks, which far exceeds what would be expected from a purely decorative or ritual tradition. If these are not words, they argue, then they are something very close to words, a system of communication that allowed households to mark property, record transactions, convey messages, preserve knowledge. The prevailing academic consensus, however, remains cautious. Most archaeologists classify the Vinča symbols as proto-writing, a term that acknowledges their communicative function while denying them the full status of literacy. Proto-writing systems encode information, but they do not represent the sounds of spoken language, the phonetic building blocks that allow true writing to record any utterance, any thought, any narrative a speaker might wish to preserve. The symbols might signify 3 sheep, or harvest complete, or offering to the ancestors, but they could not, according to this view, encode the sentence, "Standing here at the river's edge, I remember the day my father taught me to fish." They lack the grammatical and phonetic complexity that characterizes the scripts of Sumer, Egypt, China, Mesoamerica, the literate civilizations whose texts we can read, whose voices we can hear across the millennia. Yet even if the Vinča symbols are proto-writing, even if they fall short of full literacy, they remain extraordinary, a testament to the cognitive sophistication and symbolic ambition of the old European peoples, an achievement that predates by 2,000 years the earliest undisputed writing, and that suggests, at the very least, that the threshold of literacy was not as distant, not as impossible, as the silence of the archaeological record might otherwise suggest. The question that haunts all discussions of the Vinča symbols is not merely what they mean, but why they stopped. Why did a tradition that persisted for over a millennium, that spread across a vast region, that was employed by communities at the height of their cultural and technological achievement, simply cease? Why do the symbols disappear from the archaeological record after 3500 BC, leaving no successor scripts, no evolved descendants, no trace in the literate civilizations that would later arise in the same regions? The answer is inseparable from the larger question of what happened to old Europe itself, the collapse of the cultural complex that had flourished in the Balkans and the Danube basin for 3,000 years, and that, by the middle of the 4th millennium BC, was beginning to disintegrate. The collapse was not a singular event. It was not a conquest, not an invasion, not a catastrophe that could be dated to a specific year or even a specific generation. It was a process, a slow unravelling that played out over centuries, visible in the archaeological record as a series of absences, discontinuities, endings that accumulate until the world they describe is unrecognisable. The burial tradition at Varna, which had reached its zenith around 4500 BC with the deposition of gold and copper in quantities unmatched anywhere else on Earth, ceases around 4200 BC. The necropolis is abandoned, the graves no longer filled, the rituals that had honoured the dead and affirmed the social hierarchies of the living no longer performed. Why did the people of Varna stop burying their elite with gold? Did the gold run out, the mines exhausted, the trade routes severed? Did the social structures that had justified such displays of wealth collapse, the chieftains who once commanded the labour and loyalty of thousands losing their authority, their legitimacy, their hold on power? Or did the cosmology that had made those burials meaningful shift, the beliefs that connected the living and the dead, the earth and the sky, the present and the eternal, giving way to new ideas, new practices, new gods who demanded different offerings? The site offers no answers. The last graves at Varna are poorer, simpler, their goods modest, their gold scarce, and then the graves stop altogether, and the necropolis falls silent. The Vinča symbol system too fades. The latest inscribed objects, including the Tertaria tablets and a handful of other artifacts from sites in Transylvania and Serbia, date to around 3500 BC, and after that the symbols vanish. No successor tradition emerges, no new script arises to take their place. The pots and figurines of the cultures that follow, the Baden culture, the Kosopheni culture, the early Bronze Age societies of the Carpathian Basin, are unmarked, or marked only with simple geometric patterns that carry none of the symbolic density, none of the communicative ambition of the Vinča signs. Whatever knowledge the symbols encoded, whatever stories or records or rituals they preserved, was lost. If there were individuals who could read the signs, who understood their meanings and their grammar, they died without passing that knowledge on, and the tradition died with them. The Cucuteni-Trypillia mega-settlements, the egalitarian cities that had no precedent and would have no successor, were abandoned. The great circular towns like Majdanetski and Taljanki, which at their peak had housed tens of thousands of people, were burned and left empty. The tradition of deliberate house burning, which had been practiced ritually every 75 to 80 years for a millennium, continued into the final phase, but the settlements were not rebuilt. The inhabitants dispersed, moving into smaller villages, into a landscape that was emptier, more fragmented, less connected. By 3500 BC, the megasite system had collapsed entirely. The populations that remained in the region lived in communities of a few dozen households at most, practicing mixed farming and pastoralism, their material culture simpler, their trade networks more localized, their social organization less complex. The great concentric rings of houses, the central plazas, the evidence of assembly and consensus that had characterized the mega-settlements were gone, replaced by scattered farmsteads and small hamlets that left little mark on the land. Archaeologist Douglas Bailey, in his synthesis of the evidence, frames the collapse not as a simple conquest, not as the triumph of steppe invaders over sedentary farmers, but as a systemic failure, a convergence of ecological, social and demographic pressures that together overwhelmed the resilience of the old European world. The land was exhausted, the forests cleared, the soils eroded, the game depleted. Centuries of intensive agriculture and settlement had degraded the environment to the point where it could no longer support the dense populations of the megasites. The climate may have shifted, becoming drier or more variable, making harvest less predictable and increasing the risk of famine. Disease may have swept through the crowded settlements, epidemics of plague or other infectious diseases that turned the tightly packed houses into death traps and forced the survivors to burn everything and flee. Social inequality, which had been rising since 3800 BC, may have destabilized the egalitarian structures that had held the communities together, creating tensions and conflicts that the consensus-based governance systems could not resolve. And from the east, from the steppe, new peoples were arriving, pastoralists with mobile lifeways and hierarchical social structures, peoples who brought with them new technologies, wheeled vehicles, domesticated horses, bronze metallurgy, and new languages that would, over the centuries, replace the tongues spoken by the farmers of the Danube basin. The genetic evidence synthesized by Wolfgang Hack, Pontus Skoglund and their colleagues tells the story with a clarity that the artifacts alone cannot provide. The farmers of old Europe, the people who built Lepenski Vir and Vinča, who created the Varna gold hoard, who settled the megasites of the Cucuteni-Trypillia culture, were largely descended from migrants who had arrived from Anatolia around 7000 BC, part of the great Neolithic expansion that brought agriculture to Europe. These Anatolian farmers carried a distinctive genetic signature, a combination of ancestry components that set them apart from the indigenous Western hunter-gatherers who had inhabited Europe since the Ice Age and from the later Western steppe herders who had arrived from the Pontic-Caspian steppe in the 4th and 3rd millennia BC. Ancient DNA extracted from the bones of individuals buried at Varna, at Lepenski Vir, a Cucuteni-Trypillia sites in Moldova and Ukraine, confirms that these people were genetically homogeneous, part of a single broad population that stretched from the Aegean to the Carpathians, a population that had replaced or absorbed the earlier hunter-gatherers through a combination of migration and demographic expansion. By the Bronze Age, however, that genetic signature had been diluted. Analysis of Bronze Age skeletons from the same regions shows a dramatic influx of steppe-related ancestry, the legacy of the Yamnaya culture and its descendants, who moved westward from the steppe around 3000 BC. In some regions, the replacement was nearly complete, with Bronze Age populations carrying 75% or more steppe ancestry, indicating that the newcomers had not merely intermarried with the existing farmers, but had largely replaced them, through migration, through conflict, through differential survival rates that favoured the mobile pastoralists over the settled agriculturalists. Yet the Anatolian farmer ancestry did not disappear. It persisted, recessive but unbroken, through the Bronze Age, through the Iron Age, through the classical and medieval periods, down to the present day. Roughly 20 to 30% of the ancestry of modern European populations traces back to those Neolithic farmers, to the people who cleared the forests and planted the first wheat, who built the tells and the megasites, who smelted copper and traded spondylus shells and buried their dead with gold. Millions of living people, distributed across Europe from the Atlantic to the Black Sea, carry within their genomes a biological thread that connects them directly to the world of Vinča and Varna, to the egalitarian cities and the ritual burnings, to the symbols that almost became writing, and the gold that almost became kingship. The genetic data also reveals the complexity of the transition. At Lepenski Vir, analysis of 4 individuals from the site's occupation phases shows a dynamic mosaic. 2 individuals possessed entirely Anatolian farmer-related ancestry, while a third showed mixed ancestry and a diet still heavily reliant on aquatic resources, suggesting that the incoming farmers and the resident hunter-gatherers coexisted, intermarried, shared knowledge and resources, even as the demographic balance tipped decisively in favour of the agricultural newcomers. At late Cucuteni-Trypillia sites in Moldova, dated to between 3500 and 3100 BC, genomic analysis of 4 females reveals that 3 carried significant steppe-related admixture, evidence that by the terminal phase of the culture, the populations of the megasites were already genetically heterogeneous, already absorbing migrants from the east, already beginning the slow process of transformation that would define the Bronze Age. The anthropologist Joachim Berger, reflecting on the evidence for interaction between farmers and hunter-gatherers in earlier periods, observed that the two groups exchanged cultural heritage and knowledge, but rarely spouses, a pattern that suggests boundaries, distinctions, social structures that maintain separation even in the face of prolonged contact. By the late 4th millennium, however, those boundaries were breaking down, the populations mixing, the old distinctions dissolving as the ecological and social pressures mounted, and the old systems failed. What does it mean to carry the ancestry of the people who made the Tertiary tablets, who stood at the threshold of writing but never crossed it? What does it mean to know that the past is not entirely lost, that it persists in the cells of the present, encoded not in symbols on clay, but in the sequences of nucleotides that define hair colour and height, lactose tolerance and immune response, the invisible architecture of heredity that connects generation to generation across the abyss of time? The genetic thread does not carry memory, does not transmit culture or language or belief, does not preserve the knowledge of how to inscribe a tablet or cast a copper axe, or organize a community of 15,000 souls without kings or temples. But it carries something, a biological continuity that refuses the total erasure implied by the collapse of old Europe, that insists on the survival, however attenuated, of the people who built that world. They did not vanish, they were transformed, absorbed, reconfigured, but not annihilated. Their genes flowed into new populations, their descendants carried forward, unknowing, into the Bronze Age and beyond, and some fraction of that flow reaches the present, mingles with the ancestry of steppe herders and medieval knights and modern urbanites, becomes part of the vast, tangled web of human inheritance that links all of us, in ways we can measure but never fully comprehend, to the deep past. The collapse of old Europe was not the end of history. It was a rupture, a transformation, a moment when one world ended and another began, when the egalitarian agricultural communities of the Danube basin gave way to the hierarchical, mobile, metal-using societies of the Bronze Age, when the languages of the farmers were replaced by the Indo-European tongues brought by the steppe migrants, when the symbols that might have become writing fell silent, and the gold that had honoured the dead was melted down and recast into new forms for new purposes. But the people did not vanish. They adapted, they survived, they merged with the newcomers, and something of what they were, something of what they knew, persisted, even if we can no longer name it, even if the only record of its survival is written in the genomes of the living. Standing at the edge of the Danube, where the river bends and widens and reflects the sky, one might imagine the last inscriber, the final person to press a stylus into wet clay and arrange the Vinča symbols in their careful sequences, to encode a message that would never be read, to participate in a tradition whose meaning was already slipping away. Did they know they were the last? Did they sense that the world was changing, that the knowledge they carried would die with them, that the symbols they had learned from their parents and their parents' parents would soon be incomprehensible, their purpose forgotten, their voice reduced to silence? Or did they believe, as people in crisis so often do, that the system would recover, that the next generation would remember, that the unravelling they witnessed was temporary, reversible, survivable? The clay does not remember, the symbols do not speak, but the act of inscription itself, the deliberate effort to mark and to preserve, to impose order on chaos and meaning on matter, remains, a testament not to success but to the attempt, to the human refusal to let knowledge slip away without a fight, even when the fight is already lost. The attempt itself then becomes the subject. 7,500 years after the last symbol was inscribed, after the mega-settlements burned and the gold burials ceased and the networks of exchange contracted into silence, the symbols remain, scattered across more than 150 sites from the Pannonian plain to the Ukrainian forest steppe, pressed into the shoulders of clay vessels, incised along the rims of bowls, stamped into figurine torsos, etched onto spindle whorls and loom weights and ritual objects whose function we can only guess. More than 700 distinct signs, catalogued and photographed and debated, their forms ranging from simple crosses and chevrons to complex sequences of lines and angles and curves that resist easy classification, that seem to hover on the threshold between decoration and notation, between art and communication, between the arbitrary and the systematic. They are not writing, or at least not writing as Mesopotamia would define it centuries later, not a system capable of encoding the full range of human speech, not a tool for recording debt and inventory and royal genealogy. But they are not random either. They recur, they vary in predictable ways, they cluster in certain contexts and avoid others. They show patterns of distribution across geography and time that suggest intention, convention, shared understanding. They are something, and that something has resisted every effort at interpretation, every attempt to force them into the categories we have prepared for them, every methodology we have devised to crack the silence of undeciphered scripts. In the early 21st century, as computational linguistics and statistical corpus analysis transformed the study of ancient languages, researchers turned their attention to the Vinča symbols with new tools and renewed hope. At the University of Oxford, Gareth Owens, whose earlier work had focused on the statistical properties of Cretan hieroglyphic and Linear A, began analysing the frequency distributions of Vinča signs, comparing the patterns to those found in known writing systems and in non-linguistic symbolic traditions. The question was structural. Did the symbols behave like language, with the characteristic frequency curves and combinatorial rules that distinguish speech from decoration, or did they behave like heraldry, like clan markers, like the repetitive motifs of textile design? Owens's analysis, like earlier work by Shan Win in the 1980s, revealed a corpus that was tantalizing in its ambiguity. Certain signs appeared with high frequency across multiple sites, suggesting standardization, shared conventions, a degree of system-wide coherence that one would not expect from purely local or idiosyncratic markings. Other signs appeared rarely, clustered in specific regions or time periods, hinting at dialectical variation or functional specialization. The distribution of sign complexity, simple marks versus composite sequences, showed a pattern reminiscent of syllabaries, where basic phonetic units combined to form more elaborate expressions, but the sample size was too small, the context too fragmentary, to confirm the hypothesis. The symbols did not behave exactly like writing, but they did not behave exactly unlike it either. They occupied a middle ground, a grey zone between systems we understand and systems we cannot yet name. Other researchers approached the problem from different angles. Corpus analyses compared the Vinča signs to the proto-cuneiform of Uruk, searching for structural parallels, for shared principles of notation that might reveal a common origin or a universal grammar of early symbolic thought. The comparisons were provocative but inconclusive. Both systems use simple geometric forms, lines, circles, triangles, combinations thereof, but so do most early symbolic traditions, constrained as they are by the limitations of the medium, the difficulty of rendering complex curves or fine detail in wet clay or soft stone. Both systems showed a tendency towards sequence and repetition, toward arranging signs in linear chains that implied reading order and syntactic structure, but the Vinča sequences were shorter, less elaborate, less obviously tied to the bureaucratic functions, accounting, taxation, labor organization, that drove the development of writing in Mesopotamia. If the Vinča symbols were proto-writing, they were proto-writing in the service of something other than state administration, something less tangible, perhaps ritual or mnemonic or genealogical, a way of anchoring identity or belief or social obligation in a form that could be seen and shared and remembered. But without a bilingual inscription, without a context that reveals function, without the long historical continuity that allows us to trace the evolution of script from simple to complex, from pictograph to phoneme, the hypothesis remains speculative, a possibility that cannot be ruled out but cannot be confirmed. And yet the uncertainty, the very fact that we cannot read the symbols and may never read them, does not diminish their significance. If anything, it amplifies it. The existence of a sustained, geographically distributed, multi-century symbolic tradition in Neolithic Europe forces a rethinking of what civilization means, of who gets to be called civilized, of the criteria we use to separate the complex from the simple, the advanced from the primitive, the historical from the prehistoric. For more than 2 centuries, the narrative of human progress has been written from the perspective of the Near East, with Sumer and Egypt as the twin fountains of civilization, the places where agriculture gave rise to cities, where cities gave rise to writing, where writing gave rise to history itself. The rest of the world, Europe, Africa, the Americas, the Pacific, was cast in the role of latecomer or recipient. Societies that either borrowed the achievements of the East or developed them independently, but always later. always in response to the same evolutionary pressures that had already been answered elsewhere. The discovery of old Europe, of the Vinča symbols and the Varna gold, and the Cucuteni-Trypillia mega-settlements disrupts that narrative, not by replacing it with an alternative origin story, not by claiming primacy for the Balkans over Mesopotamia, but by revealing that the path to complexity was not singular, not inevitable, not defined by a checklist of traits that every society must acquire in the same order and for the same reasons. The people of the Danube basin developed metallurgy without developing bronze, urbanism without developing states, symbolic notation without developing writing, social stratification without developing kingship. They built a world that does not fit the models we have inherited, that cannot be understood through the categories we have prepared, and when that world collapsed, it left behind questions more profound than any answer we have managed to construct. What does it mean to stand before the Vinča symbols now in the 21st century, with all the tools of modern archaeology and genetics and computational analysis at our disposal, and still not know? What does it mean to confront a tradition that predates the earliest writing we can read by 2,000 years, and find ourselves unable to say with certainty whether it was writing at all, whether it was a step toward literacy or a parallel form of expression that never needed to become language because it served a different purpose, encoded a different kind of knowledge, addressed a different set of questions? The silence of the symbols is not the silence of absence, not the muteness of a people without thought or culture or sophistication. It is the silence of a conversation we were never meant to overhear, a dialogue conducted in a register we have not yet learned to perceive, between minds that organized the world differently than we do, that saw meaning where we see decoration, that valued forms of knowledge we no longer recognize. They were not preliterate in the sense of lacking something, of waiting for the arrival of writing to complete their cultural development. They were non-literate, perhaps, or differently literate, participants in a symbolic economy that did not require the full apparatus of phonetic script because it did not need to do what phonetic script does: record speech, capture the ephemeral voice, translate the spoken word into a visual form that can outlast memory and travel beyond the range of the human voice. The Vinča symbols may have been doing something else entirely, something we have no name for because we have no analogue, because the tradition that produced them did not survive long enough to explain itself, to leave behind the interpretive key that would allow us to step inside the system and understand it from within. And so, we are left with the attempt, with the act of inscription itself, repeated across 1,000 years and 1,000 kilometers, a sustained effort to mark and to preserve, to impose order on experience and meaning on matter, even if the nature of that order and the content of that meaning remain beyond our grasp. We are left with the possibility, the tantalizing and unverifiable possibility, that the people of old Europe were doing something we have not yet imagined, that they were experimenting with forms of symbolic thought that never crystallized into the writing systems we recognize, that they were asking questions about the universe and their place in it that did not require the kind of answers that can be written down and archived and transmitted across generations in the form of texts. We are left, ultimately, with the realization that the past is not a story we tell but a mystery we inhabit, a space of incomplete knowledge and irrecoverable context, where the evidence we have is always fragmentary, always mediated by time and accident and the biases of our own assumptions, and where the most honest answer to the most important questions is often the simplest and the most difficult. We do not know. The Danube still runs, as it has for millennia, cutting through the limestone gorges of the Iron Gates, spreading wide across the plains of Vojvodina and Wallachia, gathering the waters of 100 tributaries and carrying them south and east toward the Black Sea. In spring, when the snowmelt swells the current and the river runs high and clear, the surface reflects the sky, and beneath the surface, beneath the silt and the suspended sediment and the play of light on water, lie the remnants of Lepenski Vir, the trapezoidal houses and the fish-eyed sculptures, partially preserved, partially submerged, entombed beneath the reservoir behind the Iron Gates Dam. Divers visit the site now, descending through the cold water to touch the stone foundations, to see the carvings that once faced the rising sun, to move through the drowned village like ghosts among ghosts, witnesses to a settlement that was already ancient when Suma was young, that flourished and declined and was abandoned long before the symbols of Vinča were inscribed, long before the gold of Varna was hammered and shaped and placed in the graves of the dead. The dam was built in the 1960s and 70s, a joint project of Yugoslavia and Romania, part of the great wave of hydroelectric construction that sought to harness the rivers of Europe for power and flood control and economic development, and the flooding of Lepenski Vir was seen at the time as an acceptable cost, a sacrifice necessary for progress. Some of the site was excavated before the waters rose, some of the sculptures and artifacts removed and catalogued and placed in museums, but much remains below, and the river that once gave life to the settlement now hides it, covers it, holds it in suspension between memory and oblivion. Standing on the riverbank, above the drowned village, one might trace the full arc of the story, from the Mesolithic hunters who first settled the gorge 9,500 years ago to the Neolithic farmers who arrived from Anatolia in the 7th millennium, bringing wheat and barley and sheep and a new way of organising the world. From the fish-eyed sculptures of Lepenski Vir to the inscribed clay of Vinča, from the polychrome spirals of Cucuteni-Trypillia pottery to the golden masks of Varna, from the burning megacities of the Ukrainian steppe to the genetic traces that persist in modern European populations, the arc bends through time, through transformation, through the endless cycles of growth and collapse, innovation and loss that define the human story. A civilization of extraordinary complexity lived here, in the valleys and plains of the Danube basin, flourished here for 3,000 years, developed technologies and art forms and social structures that rivaled and in some cases preceded those of the Near East, questioned the universe through symbol and ritual and the careful arrangement of space and matter, and then, between 3500 and 3000 BC, that civilization came apart, unravelled under the combined pressures of climate change and disease and ecological exhaustion, and the arrival of new peoples from the steppe, peoples who brought with them horses and wheels and bronze and new languages and new gods and a new way of understanding power and hierarchy and the relationship between the individual and the collective. The old world did not vanish overnight, did not succumb to a single catastrophic event, but it ended unmistakably, and what came after was different, structured by different principles, oriented toward different goals, and the knowledge that had sustained old Europe, the knowledge of how to smelt copper without tin, how to organise a community of 15,000 without kings, how to encode meaning in symbols that were almost but not quite writing. That knowledge was lost, or transformed beyond recognition, or preserved in forms so fragmentary and obscure that we can no longer access it, can no longer reconstruct the full system of thought and practice that it represented. They vanished without a written word we can read. That is the central fact. The irreducible reality that shapes every attempt to understand old Europe, every effort to recover the voices of the people who built the tells and fired the kilns and pressed the stylus into wet clay. We have their bones, their pottery, their gold, their symbols, their DNA, but we do not have their words, do not have the interior testimony that would allow us to know how they thought about themselves, what they believed, what they hoped for, what they feared. We have the material residue of their lives, the physical evidence that survives in the ground, but we do not have the intangible dimension, the subjective experience, the felt reality of being a person in that world, of waking each morning in a wattle and daub house within a concentric ring of hundreds of identical houses, of participating in the communal decision to burn the settlement every 80 years, of inscribing a symbol whose meaning you learned from your parents and will teach to your children, of knowing that you are part of a tradition that stretches back into the mists of time and will continue, you believe, into the unimaginable future. We do not have that, and we never will, and the absence is not a problem to be solved, but a condition to be accepted, a limit on knowledge that defines the boundary between what we can recover and what is lost forever. But their silence is not absence. It is not the void left by a people without thought or culture or agency. It is the silence of a world that chose, or was forced, or simply happened not to write its own history in a form that could travel across the millennia, that could speak to us directly in a voice we recognize. It is the silence of a tradition that expressed itself through other means, through architecture and art and the organization of space, through ritual and symbol, and the careful management of social relations, through the transmission of knowledge from generation to generation in forms that did not require text, that relied instead on memory and apprenticeship and the embodied practice of making and doing. That silence is an invitation, still open, to every archaeologist who excavates a new site, to every geneticist who sequences another ancient genome, to every linguist who puzzles over the symbols and searches for patterns, to every person who stands on a riverbank or walks through a museum and wonders what is underneath, what is hidden, what remains to be discovered. The past is not a closed book. It is an open question, a space of inquiry that expands rather than contracts with each new piece of evidence, each new method of analysis, each new generation of scholars and enthusiasts and amateurs who bring their own perspectives and tools and obsessions to the work of reconstruction. Old Europe is not solved. It is not finished. It is not a story with a neat conclusion and a clear moral. It is a living mystery, and the mystery deepens the more we learn, the more we realize how much we do not know, how much we can never know, how much lies forever beyond the reach of even our most sophisticated instruments and our most ingenious theories. The river still runs, the symbols remain. The gold rests in museum cases under controlled light and humidity, and the mega-settlements sleep beneath the soil of Ukraine and Moldova, their burnt walls and ash layers marking the passage of a tradition that ended without heirs, without direct descendants, without a successor culture that could explain what it all meant. But the people did not vanish. Their genes flow in the present, their ancestry mingled with that of the steppe herders and the Bronze Age traders and the Iron Age warriors and the medieval farmers and the modern urbanites who walk the streets of Belgrade and Bucharest and Sofia and Kiev, who carry within them, unknowing, a fraction of the biological inheritance of those who stood at the threshold of writing, who built the first cities, who honoured their dead with gold. The continuity is invisible, written not in symbols we can decipher, but in the sequences of nucleotides that define what it means to be human, what it means to carry forward the legacy of the past into the uncertain future. And perhaps that is enough. Perhaps the survival of the thread, however attenuated, however transformed, is the answer to the question of what remains when a civilization collapses, when the knowledge is lost and the symbols fall silent and the great cities burn and are abandoned. What remains is the people, changed but continuous, their stories forgotten but their presence undeniable, their silence not a defeat but a different kind of testimony, a reminder that history is not only what is written, but also what is lived, not only what is remembered, but also what is carried forward in the cells and the soil and the slow, patient work of the earth reclaiming its own.